The desert at night is never truly silent. Even as the day's heat bleeds away and the moon drapes the dunes in silver, you can hear it. The faint hiss of wind combing over the sand, a whispering sound like secrets exchanged in a language you almost recognize. It is here, in the pale glow, that the pyramids of Giza stand, not as mere landmarks, but as enormous stone riddles, their sharp lines cutting into a sky older than history. Now imagine, for a moment, that you could peel away every tourist's photograph, every textbook diagram, every neat date in a museum caption. What if, beneath all the labels, the story we tell about these monuments is wrong? What if the Egyptians, the remarkable people who recorded their lives in meticulous hieroglyphs, were not the original builders at all, but inheritors, caretakers of something they themselves didn't fully understand? It's a strange thought, isn't it? We've been told the pyramids are about 4,500 years old, tied to kings with names like Khufu, Khafra and Menkaure. Yet, now and then, evidence rises like a half-buried stone from the sand. Geological patterns, ancient myths, astronomical puzzles that seem to point further back, much further, and not everyone agrees on the story. So before you get too comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you really like what I'm doing here. And since we're about to go digging together in the moonlight, tell me where you are and what time it is right now. Maybe we'll find ourselves under the same stars. Now, picture this. The footprints in the sand are not all Egyptian. Some lead away, vanishing into a deeper past. If you follow those faint trails back far enough, they lead to a time before the Old Kingdom, before the dynasties and their golden masks. They lead to an Egypt that was not yet Egypt, just a fertile land at the edge of a greener Sahara, its horizon broken by unfamiliar shapes. Imagine wandering through this ancient landscape, the Nile in full flood, hippos grunting in the shallows, birds wheeling in great flocks above reed-choked banks. Here, instead of modern Cairo's sprawl, you'd find open savanna and scattered human settlements, small but capable. And there, on a plateau of bedrock, the stones are already rising. Not the half-crumbled ruins of weathered centuries, but new blocks, freshly quarried, lifted with some technique that no living eye remembers. These early builders, whoever they were, may not have left us names. Their language may have vanished entirely, and yet their fingerprints are there in the stone, the precise joins, the impossible alignment, the scale that defies easy explanation. Historians are still debating whether such structures could predate Egypt's first pharaohs, or whether all this speculation is a mirage born of selective evidence. But when you stand in the shadow of the Great Pyramid and notice the wear on the limestone base, erosion that some geologists argue took thousands of years to form, you can't help but wonder. One authoritative fact is certain. The Giza Plateau has been continuously occupied and used for at least 5,000 years. But here's an odd, almost off-topic fact. In the same span of time, the Sahara transformed from lush grassland to one of the driest places on Earth. If the pyramids were here before that shift, their builders would have worked in a climate we can barely imagine, a place of storms, rivers, and summer rain. The official story, of course, ties the pyramids neatly to the Fourth Dynasty, but the official story also leaves quiet gaps. Who levelled the bedrock so perfectly? Who understood the sky well enough to place these monuments in harmony with Orion's belt? Was it all just Egyptian ingenuity? Or is this the echo of an older world, hidden under the long shadow of recorded history? You can decide for yourself how far down this path you want to go. Just be careful. Once you start following those footprints, it becomes harder to accept the neatly printed timelines, and the sand, as always, is patient. It will cover what it must. It will wait for you to dig. The desert has a way of keeping secrets in plain sight. The stones of the pyramids themselves are part of that concealment, not just their shape and size, but the story etched in their very grains. When you stand close enough to place your palm against the cool limestone, you're not just touching a block, you're pressing your hand to a page in Earth's own geological diary. And some of those pages, oddly enough, seem to whisper dates far older than the accepted ones. The bedrock of the Giza Plateau is Miocene limestone, formed roughly 30 million years ago in an ancient seabed, filled with tiny fossil shells you can still spot if you look carefully. But the blocks that form the pyramids aren't just raw bedrock. They were quarried, shaped, and set with astonishing precision. Most Egyptologists agree these were cut using copper chisels, dolerite pounders, and patient manual labour. But a few geologists point to something stranger. Certain granite and limestone blocks bear markings that don't seem to match the tool patterns expected from Egypt's Old Kingdom technology. This is where things get interesting. Granite, used in the interior chambers and passages, is incredibly hard. Harder than steel, in fact, when it comes to resisting scratches. Copper chisels, even the best ones, would have blunted quickly. The official explanation is that ancient workers used pounding stones to chip away at the granite, combined with sand as an abrasive to slowly wear it down. But a small camp of researchers argues that some surfaces are too smooth, too finely cut, as if shaped by more advanced techniques. You might hear whispers of lost tools or forgotten methods, though most mainstream scholars wave away such speculation. Still, the marks are there. An authoritative fact: the granite used in the Great Pyramid came from Aswan, nearly 900 kilometres to the south. The logistics of transporting stones weighing up to 70 tons through the Nile's cataracts remain one of ancient engineering's greatest feats. And here's an odd fact. Among the blocks at the base of the pyramid are a few that are not local limestone at all, but a fossil-rich variety from a geologic layer that lies far deeper underground than any quarrying site known from the 4th dynasty. Why go to such trouble to source those specific stones, when closer materials were plentiful? Some geologists have suggested that weathering patterns on certain blocks indicate exposure to the elements for far longer than 4,500 years. Imagine a granite beam set in place, its sharp edges slowly worn down by centuries of rain and wind, centuries before Khufu's reign. If that's true, the question becomes unavoidable. Who set the beam in the first place? And this is where the timeline begins to fray. In mainstream archaeology, the pyramids are a product of a few short decades of intense building. But when you look at the stones themselves, the mix of wear levels, the occasional patchwork repairs that seem ancient in their own right, you start to wonder if we're seeing not one construction event, but layers of use and reuse. Could it be that parts of the pyramids were already standing when the Egyptians we know from history took over the plateau? Let's step back for a moment and think about ancient quarries. Most were cut close to the worksite for obvious reasons. Moving multi-ton blocks over long distances was exhausting, risky and costly. But scattered across Egypt are quarries whose output has never been matched to a known monument. One such site near Abu Rawash shows evidence of massive block extraction, yet the location's pyramid, often attributed to Geodetic, is so ruined that no one is certain what was built there. Some scholars suggest that stones from abandoned or much older structures might have been repurposed for Giza. There's also the curious case of megalithic over-engineering. In the Great Pyramid's core you find blocks weighing an average of 2.5 tons each, already massive. But here and there, you'll encounter monsters 3 or 4 times that weight, seemingly doing the same job as smaller ones. If efficiency was the goal, why lift a 10-ton block when a 3-ton block would suffice? Was it a show of power, a display of mastery? Or are we looking at remnants from an earlier phase of construction, when size was dictated by a different tradition? Historians are still debating whether the tool marks inside certain granite beams are the result of copper saws with sand abrasives or some lost form of cutting. One controversial hypothesis even suggests the use of primitive drilling devices with stone or metal tips, which could explain the occasional deep, smooth boreholes found in unrelated ancient Egyptian artifacts. While such tools would not be high technology in the modern sense, Their presence could push back the date of certain works to an era before the well-documented Old Kingdom toolkits. If you were to kneel down and inspect the blocks at eye level, you might notice something else. Faint, almost invisible lines of fossilized sea life running like stripes across the stone faces. These lines don't align between some adjacent blocks, as if the stones had been cut from different layers and then assembled without regard for matching the patterns. This could be nothing more than quarry logistics, or it could hint that blocks from multiple, widely separated quarrying campaigns were brought together to form a single structure. Now, picture yourself in the role of Khufu, assuming the plateau as your royal project. If you inherited part of a massive enigmatic structure, already ancient, already awe-inspiring, would you demolish it? Or would you incorporate it into your own design, claiming it as your own? After all, history favours those who leave their names carved deepest into the stone. Oddly enough, this idea isn't foreign to human history. In many parts of the world, rulers have claimed monuments built by earlier cultures. The Romans built over Etruscan works. Medieval churches rose on pagan temples. Modern cities stand on ancient ruins. If the Egyptians inherited even a portion of the pyramid structures, it would be one more example of this timeless recycling of grandeur. And here's a final strange detail for tonight's walk through the stones. Some blocks deep within the pyramid's core bear marks that appear to be older than the mortar holding them in place. Mortar analysis suggests a date consistent with the 4th dynasty. But if the blocks were weathered long before they were mortared, then those stones may have had another life before Khufu's architects claimed them. When you step back from the base of the Great Pyramid and let your eyes trace its ascending tiers into the starlight, you can feel the tension between two timelines, the clean, precise one in the textbooks, and the messier, more layered one whispered by the geology. One tells you these stones have stood for 4,500 years. The other suggests some of them may have been part of the landscape far longer, quarried shaped, and waiting for a civilization ambitious enough to lift them into the sky. And in the end, the stone doesn't care which story we choose to believe. It will hold its secrets as long as it takes. When you think of the Nile today, you probably picture the long, steady ribbon of water winding through Egypt, flanked by green fields that stand in defiance of the desert. But the Nile you know is not the Nile that existed when the first stones were laid at Giza, or perhaps when those stones were already standing. Rivers are restless things. They change course, they shift their banks, they vanish into dry beds and return again, and the Nile's ancient wanderings may hold a quiet clue about the true age of the pyramids. In the deep past, the Nile was not one river, but a braided, complex network of channels and seasonal floodplains. The annual flooding, fed by distant rains in the Ethiopian highlands, could swell the river until it spilled across miles of fertile land. These floods were the lifeblood of ancient Egypt's agriculture, but they were also unpredictable. Entire settlements could be cut off, buried under silt, or swept away. Geological surveys of the Giza plateau suggest that the river's main course once ran much closer to the pyramids than it does today, close enough that massive stone blocks could have been floated directly from quarries to the construction site. The official story explains this as a deliberate engineering feat of the Old Kingdom, canals dug from the river to transport materials, but sediment cores taken from the area show something unexpected. Layers of fine silt that predate the 4th dynasty by centuries, even millennia. This suggests that a branch of the Nile may have hugged the plateau long before Khufu's reign. And if the river was there earlier, so too could have been the infrastructure to use it, ramps, docks, or even rudimentary harbours. These features, now buried under sand and urban development, might have served builders from a forgotten period. Historians are still debating whether the ancient floodplain evidence lines up neatly with known dynastic timelines, or whether it hints at activity in a pre-dynastic era entirely. One authoritative fact: archaeological digs have uncovered the remains of a harbour complex near the pyramids, with large limestone blocks forming quays and basins. The odd fact: Some of these blocks show water-wear patterns inconsistent with the arid climate of the Old Kingdom. It's as though they sat for centuries in a wetter environment before being incorporated into the later harbour structures. It's worth pausing here to consider the river not just as a means of transport, but as a living boundary between worlds. In ancient Egyptian thought, the Nile was a divine artery, a reflection of the cosmic river that flowed through the afterlife. If the pyramids were inherited monuments, their proximity to the Nile might not have been coincidental. Perhaps they were placed, or found, at a site where water, earth and sky met in perfect harmony, making it sacred in ways we can only guess. Now picture a time before the Sahara was a desert. The Green Sahara period, as scientists call it, lasted from about 10,000 to 5,000 years ago, when monsoon rains drenched North Africa. Vast lakes spread across what is now barren sand. The Nile would have been fed not just by distant mountain rains, but by local rivers flowing down from verdant highlands. In such a world, Giza's plateau would have been a strategic location, high ground overlooking a lush plain, with easy river access and visibility for miles. If construction, or at least the first, shaping of the site, began during that greener time, it would place the origins of the pyramids thousands of years before Egypt's historical kings. It's a controversial hypothesis, but it gained some traction from the erosional patterns seen on other monuments, like the Sphinx, which some argue could only have been caused by heavy prolonged rainfall. Think about what that means. Workers moving massive stones not under a scorching desert sun, but in a humid, fertile environment, surrounded by grasslands and teeming wildlife. Hippos and crocodiles would have slid through the waters near the site. Herds of antelope grazed where tourists now queue for camel rides. The builders, whoever they were, would have had ample food, water and timber, resources far scarcer in the arid Egypt of the dynasties. And yet, this lushness wouldn't last. Climate change is not a modern invention. It's a constant drumbeat in Earth's history. Around 5,000 years ago, the monsoon shifted, the rains failed, and the Sahara began to dry. Rivers shrank, grasslands became dunes, populations would have been forced to migrate, clustering along the narrowing Nile Valley. If the pyramids were older, this desertification could explain why their original builders vanished from the record, leaving only the stones. Oddly enough, the Nile's shifting course may also explain certain mismatches in pyramid alignment theories. Many believe the pyramids were precisely oriented to cardinal directions, but tiny deviations exist. Deviations that some researchers think could be due to changes in surveying techniques, or to the gradual movement of the river, which might have served as a visual guide. If the earliest builders used the river as a reference line, and that river later moved, it could mean the original context of the alignments is lost to us. There's another layer here, one that feels almost too poetic to be coincidence. In ancient Egyptian funerary texts, the afterlife journey often involves crossing a river. If the pyramids were already ancient in the Egyptians' time, perhaps they were repurposed as grand ferries for the dead, symbolic vessels positioned beside the Nile's waters to carry the soul into eternity. In that case, the river's ancient proximity would have been not just practical, but spiritual. The evidence, as always, is frustratingly incomplete. Sediment cores can tell you about ancient water levels, but they can't tell you who stood on the shore. Stone can preserve wear patterns, but not the name of the mason who carved it. And so, we're left to fill in the gaps with careful hypotheses and, sometimes, with imagination. One such hypothesis, advanced by a handful of archaeologists, is that the Giza plateau served as a ceremonial site long before it became a royal necropolis. In this view, the plateau's bedrock features, its natural high points, its orientation to the horizon, were enhanced by early construction, perhaps beginning as modest stone platforms or proto-pyramids. These would have been expanded and transformed over centuries, culminating in the massive monuments we see today. If true, this would explain why the Nile's ancient floodplain aligned so well with the plateau's edges. The site was chosen and prepared in a time when the river's embrace was closer. An off-topic but intriguing fact. In 2017, archaeologists discovered an ancient papyrus in the Red Sea region, the diary of a man named Mera who worked transporting limestone to Giza. His records are from Khufu's reign, and they describe ferrying blocks along canals to the construction site. But Mera's writings say nothing about building the core of the pyramid, only about delivering casing stones. Could it be that Khufu's team was finishing or refurbishing an existing monument, rather than creating it from scratch? The Nile's canals would have been perfect for such a task. When you look at the pyramids through this watery lens, their relationship to the river becomes more than just a logistical convenience. It becomes a thread connecting climate history, human settlement, and the possibility of a forgotten era. The Nile may have been the pyramid's lifeline twice, once in a time so old we barely have a name for it, and again in the days of the pharaohs, who made the river and the stones their own. And as you stand on the plateau, the wind carrying a faint scent of water from far below, you can almost hear the rush of a long-vanished current, lapping against docks that may have crumbled thousands of years before Khufu was even born. From the Giza plateau, the night sky seems impossibly wide. In the dry desert air, the stars burn with a steadiness that city dwellers never see. No flicker, no haze, just cold points of light in a deep black sea. It's hard not to notice how the pyramids seem to lean toward them, how their lines and angles echo something written overhead. And perhaps that's no accident at all. For years, researchers have pointed out that the three pyramids of Giza resemble the three stars of Orion's belt: Al-Nitak, Al-Nilam, and Mintaka. The alignment isn't perfect if you compare it to the present-day night sky, but that's where the concept of precession comes in. Earth's axis wobbles like a slow-spinning top, completing one cycle roughly every 26,000 years. This means the positions of stars relative to the horizon shift slowly over millennia. If you rewind the sky far enough, the match between pyramid layout and Orion's belt becomes strikingly closer. Not around 2500 BCE, but around 10,500 BCE. Mainstream archaeology doesn't accept that as proof of an earlier construction date, but it does raise a fascinating question. If the alignment is intentional, why choose a pattern that fits best thousands of years before the official building period? Some argue it's coincidence. Three large monuments in a row are bound to remind us of three bright stars. Others believe the alignment was symbolic, a link to the god Osiris, who was associated with Orion and the afterlife. But what if the reason is simpler and stranger? What if the monuments were first laid out when Orion truly stood in that ancient position, under a sky remembered only in myths? An authoritative fact: many ancient cultures used the stars as a calendar, marking agricultural and ceremonial events by their rising and setting. The Egyptians were no exception. Odd fact: ancient tombs and temples across Egypt, not just at Giza, display alignments to celestial events that no longer occur as they did thousands of years ago. These are often explained as symbolic gestures, but some alignments fit best to dates before Egypt's historical records even begin. The stars may also have guided more than just the layout of the pyramids. Scholars have noted that the shafts inside the Great Pyramid, narrow passageways cut from the internal chambers, are aimed toward specific stars. During the Old Kingdom, one shaft would have pointed toward the star Thuban in the constellation Draco, then the pole star. Another may have targeted Orion's belt, but if you calculate the angles backward, you find that some of these alignments make more sense in earlier epochs. It's as if the architecture was designed for a sky the builders were familiar with, but which has since drifted away. Of course, there are counter-arguments. Some Egyptologists argue that the alignments are too rough to be functional observatories, and that their symbolic importance outweighs any precise astronomical purpose. But if we accept the possibility of older origins, then the symbolism itself may have been inherited. Egyptian religion adapting and reinterpreting a layout whose original meaning was already fading. This brings us to another point of curiosity. Why Orion? In Egyptian myth, Orion represented Osiris, the god of resurrection and the afterlife, while the Milky Way was seen as the celestial Nile. If the pyramids mirrored Orion's belt beside a river of stars, they could have been part of a massive cosmic diagram, a reflection of heaven on earth. The question is whether the Egyptians created this diagram themselves, or whether they found it already drawn in stone. There's also the possibility that Orion wasn't the only constellation in play. Some archaeoastronomers point to Sirius, the brightest star in the night sky, which heralded the Nile flood and was linked to the goddess Isis. Others see connections to the Pleiades, a small cluster often associated with timekeeping. Alignments involving these stars would also shift over thousands of years, which could explain why the relationships seem off today. Imagine yourself standing on the plateau in 10,500 BCE. The air is cool, the sky brilliant. Orion rises in the east, his belt tilted in perfect correspondence to the three pyramids, if indeed they were already there. The Nile, closer then, glimmers under the starlight, a mirror to the Milky Way above. To a people attuned to the rhythms of the cosmos, such symmetry would have been more than aesthetic. It would have been sacred. Historians are still debating whether such ancient sky knowledge was possible, but evidence from other parts of the world suggests it might have been. Megalithic sites like Göbekli Tepe in modern Turkey, dated to around 11,000 years ago, show that people of that era could create sophisticated, symbolically rich architecture. If they could carve pillars with celestial motifs, could others have shaped stone on a grander scale? And here's an off-topic but compelling fact. Certain ancient cultures described a first time when gods or ancestors established order, often linked to celestial events. In Polynesian traditions, star alignments mark the founding of sacred sites. In Mesoamerica, pyramids and temples align with solstices and equinoxes. The idea of encoding the heavens into the earth seems almost universal. The Giza pyramids also share a peculiar orientation. Each side faces a cardinal direction with remarkable accuracy, deviating by only a fraction of a degree. Achieving this without compasses or modern surveying tools is impressive in any age. One method would have been to track the rising and setting of specific stars across the horizon, a method more accurate in some epochs than others. If the orientation matches best with a star path from thousands of years earlier, that's one more quiet nudge toward an older origin. Some skeptics will point out that all this could be a layering of coincidences and later modifications. Perhaps the Egyptians built the pyramids exactly when history says they did, using knowledge inherited from star watchers of earlier centuries. That alone would be fascinating, a case of cultural memory stretching across generations, adapting old wisdom to new monuments. But if the monuments themselves are older, then the sky becomes not just a decoration, but a clock, and the pyramids are its hands, frozen in a position they held long ago. The precession of the equinoxes is relentless. It means that a star's rising point today is not where it was for your grandparents, and certainly not for the builders of Giza. That drift is what allows modern researchers to rewind the heavens and guess at what the sky looked like in any given year. When they do this for Orion's belt and the pyramids, the match around 10,500 BCE is uncanny. The human mind is prone to pattern recognition. We see faces in clouds, animals in constellations. But sometimes the pattern is real, and it has a purpose. If the pyramids were indeed positioned under a different sky, then they are not just tombs or monuments. They are a message, one written not in hieroglyphs, but in the slow language of the cosmos, meant to outlast floods, droughts, and even civilizations. A message we've only recently learned how to read again. And so, as the night deepens and Orion climbs higher, you might feel a strange sense of connection, not just to the ancient Egyptians, but to whoever first looked up from this plateau and decided to carve the sky into the earth. Perhaps they are long forgotten. Perhaps their names are dust. But their design is still here, standing in the dark, perfectly aligned to a memory of the stars. Beneath the sun-baked stones and the orderly tourist paths, there is another Giza, one you cannot see, though you're standing right on top of it. It is a Giza of hidden chambers, sealed corridors, and anomalies that don't appear on any map sold in the gift shop. This is the underground realm of the plateau, and for some, it is the most intriguing part of the mystery. We know the Egyptians were skilled at building underground. Tombs in the Valley of the Kings plunge deep into the rock, twisting through multiple chambers. At Saqqara, the step pyramid complex hides catacombs that stretch for hundreds of meters. But the subterranean features of Giza are different, less documented, more whispered about. And in some cases, what we know comes not from open excavation, but from technologies the ancients could never have imagined. In the late 20th century, teams began using ground-penetrating radar and other geophysical surveys to scan beneath the plateau. The results were tantalizing: voids, anomalies, and patterns that suggested hidden structures far below the surface. Some appeared directly beneath the pyramids themselves, others in the bedrock to the east and west. Egypt's authorities have often been cautious about confirming or publicizing such findings, leading to a fertile breeding ground for speculation. An authoritative fact: there is a known network of tunnels and pits beneath the plateau, including the so-called Osiris Shaft, a multi-level chamber system carved deep into the rock. Odd fact: the Osiris Shaft contains a flooded lower chamber with a sarcophagus submerged in water. Its age and purpose remain uncertain, and no definitive artifacts tie it to a specific pharaoh. The existence of these underground spaces raises questions about their chronology. Were they carved at the same time as the pyramids? Before? After? If some of these voids predate the Egyptians' use of the plateau, they could be remnants of a much earlier phase, one whose builders had different purposes altogether. Historians are still debating whether all underground features are purely funerary in nature, or whether some might have served as storage, ceremonial chambers, or even shelters from environmental disasters. And then there are the stories. Local legends, recorded as far back as medieval times, speak of a vast network of passages connecting the pyramids to the Nile, and even to distant temples. Some tales mention a hall of records buried beneath the Sphinx, containing knowledge from a vanished civilization. Mainstream Egyptology dismisses such legends as fanciful, but the idea persists, kept alive by a combination of unverified radar images, the secrecy of some excavations, and our own human tendency to believe in hidden treasure. What could be under there? If you're inclined to think practically, the answer might be caches of tools, storage for ritual items, or unused burial chambers. If you lean toward the speculative, it could be anything from the remains of an older, unknown culture to evidence of contact with distant lands. Some hypothesize that in the wetter climate of the distant past, these chambers could have been watertight refuges, or part of a system to manage floodwaters from the nearby Nile. Imagine walking through one of these subterranean spaces without electric light. The air would be still and cool, thick with the scent of stone and time. Your footsteps would echo off walls cut so precisely that you could mistake them for modern masonry. In your torchlight, you might see niches for statues, half-finished corridors, or even sealed doorways whose contents have not been seen in thousands of years. The silence would be absolute, except for the distant sound of dripping water, like the heartbeat of the earth itself. The Osiris Shaft is particularly curious. Its upper level contains rectangular niches and a central shaft leading down to the second level, where more niches line the walls. The lowest level is flooded year-round, suggesting either a natural connection to the water table or a deliberately designed feature. Divers who have explored the flooded chamber report that the stone sarcophagus there is too large to remove without dismantling the surrounding rock. No inscriptions tell us who was buried there, if anyone. If this is Old Kingdom work, it is unusually elaborate. If it is older, it might represent a completely different cultural tradition. An off-topic but intriguing fact. In 2017, scientists using cosmic ray muon detection discovered a large, previously unknown void above the Grand Gallery inside the Great Pyramid. It's still sealed, and no one knows whether it is an empty space left by the builders, a hidden chamber, or something else entirely. It's a reminder that even the most studied monument in the world can still keep secrets. There is also the mysterious rectangular cut in the bedrock near the Sphinx, long speculated to be an entrance to deeper structures. Egypt's Ministry of Antiquities has said it is a natural fissure, but older photographs suggest worked stone in its interior walls. Could it have been sealed deliberately? If so, by whom and why? One hypothesis suggests that some underground features predate the pyramids and may have influenced their placement. If you already had a network of chambers aligned in a particular way, you might build monumental structures above them to mark or protect what lay beneath. In this scenario, the pyramids could be the surface expression of a much older plan, their alignment dictated not just by stars and cardinal directions, but by the invisible geometry of what was underground. It's a haunting idea that the visible pyramids are only the tip of the iceberg, and that a vast hidden architecture extends below, carved in an age when the plateau looked very different. The bedrock itself could be honeycombed with relics of an unknown past, their stories sealed behind stone and sediment. Historians are still debating the balance between documented archaeology and the allure of speculation, but one thing is certain. We have not yet seen all that Giza has to show us. Technology will no doubt reveal more in time: radar scans, muon tomography, and perhaps even robotic probes exploring spaces that no human has entered in millennia. Until then, the underground Giza remains part of the riddle. Whether the voids and shafts are the work of Egyptians, predecessors, or even multiple cultures layered through time, they remind us that what we see on the surface is never the whole story. And as the wind sweeps across the plateau at night, you might imagine that sound as the breath of the tunnels below, exhaling secrets into the desert air. The surface of the Giza plateau tells one story, but the ancient texts tell another. Not the neat hieroglyph-covered stone walls you see in the museums. Those are the official records, the polished accounts of kings who wanted their reigns remembered forever. I'm talking about the older, stranger hints buried in Egypt's myths and inscriptions. Stories about the time before the time, when Egypt was ruled not by mortal kings, but by beings the texts call the followers of Horus. The Egyptians themselves told us that their history stretched far beyond the dynasties we know. In the king lists carved at Abydos and Saqqara, you see the names of rulers going back to Nama, the unifier of Upper and Lower Egypt around 3100 BCE. But then there are other records, more mythical than historical, like those preserved by the priest Manetho in the 3rd century BCE. According to Manetho, Egypt was first ruled by gods, then by demigods, and only later by humans. The reigns of these gods and demigods supposedly lasted for thousands of years, so long that modern historians tend to classify them as purely symbolic or allegorical. And yet, some of those ancient reigns coincide intriguingly with the supposed date of the Zep Tepi, the first time, a mythical golden age when the gods walked among men and established the foundations of civilization. To the Egyptians, Zep Tepi was not metaphor but distant memory, an era when knowledge and order were given to humanity by divine beings. Historians are still debating whether such myths are purely metaphorical or whether they could be distorted echoes of a forgotten pre-dynastic culture. Here's an authoritative fact. There are Old Kingdom texts that credit the design and construction of certain temples to gods or to the followers of Horus, even though these buildings clearly show human craftsmanship. This could simply be a religious way of attributing inspiration, much like medieval cathedrals being said to be built to the glory of God. But it's curious that the same divine credit is sometimes applied to structures whose origins are more obscure, structures like the pyramids. Odd fact, in the pyramid texts, the oldest known religious writings, the king is often said to join the company of the followers of Horus after death. implying that these figures still existed somewhere, if not physically, then in the eternal realm. That imagery has led some fringe theorists to suggest that the followers were a real people, perhaps a more advanced culture predating the dynasties, who left behind monuments like the pyramids as their legacy. If you strip away the mythology, what remains is a tantalizing possibility. The Egyptians may have inherited not just physical structures from an earlier culture, but also a cultural memory of that culture's existence. Over centuries, those memories became myth, and the original builders became gods in the Egyptian mind. If that's the case, the pyramids could be the surviving work of the same people who inspired the legends of the Zep-Tepi. There are parallels in other civilizations. The Sumerians spoke of kings who ruled before the Great Flood, their reigns lasting thousands of years. The Maya traced their knowledge to the gods who came from the sea. In both cases, archaeologists interpret these as myth, but they may also preserve fragments of real, prehistoric events. Could Egypt's followers of Horus be another example of a forgotten culture immortalized in legend? Now picture the Giza plateau before the Egyptians we know from history claimed it. Perhaps there is already a pyramid there, or at least the beginning of one, a vast geometric shell of stone built by people whose name we'll never know. Their tools are gone, their villages long buried, but their structure stands, weathering the centuries. When the early Egyptians arrive, they see it as a divine gift. They add to it, reshape it, and write their names into the stone. In this way, both stories are true. The pyramids are Egyptian in the sense that they became part of Egypt's identity, but their bones might be older. One hypothesis worth considering is that the myths of divine builders were originally tied to real, extraordinary feats of engineering that the later Egyptians couldn't replicate. Imagine inheriting a building technique so far beyond your own capability that it might as well be magic. What better explanation than that it came from gods? Of course, the mainstream academic view is more restrained. Most scholars see the myths of the Zep-Tepi as symbolic accounts of the establishment of order over chaos, a common theme in ancient thought. But even they acknowledge that the Egyptians looked back to a time before their own, and that they believed themselves to be the heirs of something older. The question is how much older, and whether any of that earlier era survives in stone. An off-topic but fascinating fact: some of the earliest depictions of pyramids in Egyptian art show them as already complete and surrounded by thriving cities. This is odd, because if they were under construction during the artist's lifetimes, you might expect depictions of the work itself. Instead, they appear as timeless, eternal fixtures of the landscape, as if they had always been there. Legends about the followers of Horus sometimes link them to distant lands, implying that they were travellers or settlers who arrived in the Nile Valley with advanced knowledge. This idea fits with theories of ancient seafaring cultures capable of long-distance travel during the early Holocene. If such a culture existed, its arrival could explain sudden leaps in technology and architecture, just as similar leaps occurred in other parts of the world when disparate peoples came into contact. Some Egyptologists dismiss this as unnecessary speculation. After all, human ingenuity is capable of great things without outside help. But when you combine the myths, the geological evidence, and the architectural anomalies, a pattern begins to emerge. There was a before that the Egyptians themselves acknowledged, even if they wrapped it in the language of gods. The followers of Horus vanish from the historical record as suddenly as they appear in it. Perhaps that's because they were never literal rulers, only mythic archetypes. Or perhaps they were a real people, and their disappearance marks a cultural break so deep that later Egyptians could only remember them in stories. If the pyramids belonged first to the followers, then the Egyptians' role was that of curators rather than creators. They would have built upon the foundations, repaired what was damaged, and infused the structures with their own religious symbolism. Over time, the original identity of the builders would fade, replaced by the official narrative of pharaonic achievement. Standing at the base of the Great Pyramid today, with the wind tugging at your clothes and the stones towering above you, it's easy to believe that these myths have a kernel of truth. You're looking up at something that feels not just old, but ancient in a way that defies measurement. The followers of Horus may be gone, but if they ever existed, their greatest work still stands, catching the first light of dawn just as it did in the first time. South of the Great Pyramid, crouched in the sand like a silent guardian, lies the Sphinx. Its face stares east toward the rising sun, its body stretching out in feline repose. You've seen it in photographs 100 times, but standing before it is a different experience. The scale is overwhelming, not just its size, but the sense that it has been here forever. And in a way, it might have been, far longer than the reign of the kings whose names are etched into history. The Sphinx is officially attributed to Pharaoh Khafra of the 4th dynasty, around 2500 BCE. This fits neatly with the conventional timeline Khafra builds his pyramid, and the Sphinx stands as its symbolic guardian. But the more closely you look, the more the story starts to shift. And the shift begins, oddly enough, with the weather. In the early 1990s, geologist Robert Schoch examined the Sphinx and its surrounding enclosure. He noticed deep, rounded patterns in the limestone walls, erosion that looked more like the result of centuries of heavy rainfall than of mere wind and sand. The problem is, heavy sustained rainfall hasn't touched the Giza plateau in thousands of years. According to climate data, the last period of significant precipitation in the region ended somewhere between 7000 and 5000 BCE, when the Sahara was still partly green. If Schoch's analysis is correct, it would mean that the Sphinx, or at least its body, was carved during that wetter era, long before the dynastic Egyptians took power. Egyptologists have countered that the erosion could be due to other factors, such as the capillary action of groundwater or unusual wind patterns. Historians are still debating whether the geological evidence really supports an earlier date, but the possibility lingers like a shadow at the edge of the official timeline. An authoritative fact: the head of the Sphinx is disproportionately small compared to its massive body. Odd fact: this mismatch has led some researchers to suggest that the head was recarved from an earlier, larger head, perhaps of a lion, or even another animal entirely. If so, the original statue could have been centuries, or even millennia, older than the familiar human-faced figure we know today. This theory gains some support from the fact that the Sphinx's head is in better condition than its body. The smaller head may have been reshaped during Khafra's time, giving the monument the likeness of the reigning pharaoh, while the older body bore the scars of thousands of years of weathering. It would be a classic example of a ruler stamping his image onto an inherited work. And if the Sphinx predates the dynasties, then what was its original purpose? Some suggest it was a marker of the equinox, its eastward gaze aligned with the rising sun on specific dates. Others believe it was part of a much larger complex, perhaps connected to structures now buried beneath the sands or lost to erosion. In the wetter climate of its early life, it might have stood beside a river channel or a ceremonial lake, its reflection shimmering in the water. The water erosion theory also dovetails with the idea of an earlier Giza, a plateau already sacred in the minds of its inhabitants, chosen for monumental works long before the pyramids we know. In this version of the story, the Sphinx could be the last survivor of a much older set of monuments, its original companions erased by time. An off-topic but intriguing fact: the Dream Stele, a granite slab placed between the Sphinx's paws by Pharaoh Thutmose IV in the 15th century BCE, tells of the king falling asleep in the shadow of the statue and dreaming that it promised him power if he would clear away the sand burying it. This means that even in the New Kingdom more than 1,000 years after Khafre, the Sphinx had already been forgotten once, swallowed by the desert and rediscovered. That cycle of burial and uncovering is a reminder of how easily monuments can vanish from human awareness. If the Sphinx itself could be forgotten in historical times, what else might have been lost in prehistory, remembered only in fragmentary myths? Some fringe theories go further, linking the Sphinx to other ancient sites through supposed global alignments, suggesting it was part of a network of monuments created by a lost civilization. While such ideas remain speculative, they echo a persistent human intuition that great works of stone are rarely isolated. They are part of something larger, something integrated. Even in the official archaeological view, the Sphinx is not a solitary statue. It is part of a complex that includes temples built from enormous blocks, some weighing more than 200 tons, fitted together with precision. The style of these blocks, with their megalithic size and irregular shapes, is unusual for Old Kingdom architecture, prompting some to suggest that the temples themselves may be older than the pharaohs who used them. One hypothesis is that the Sphinx and its associated temples were constructed in stages, with the oldest parts dating to the wetter climate and later additions made by dynastic Egyptians. In this scenario, the pharaohs were not the original builders but the restorers, adapting an ancient monument to fit their own religious framework. If you visit the Sphinx at dawn, before the crowds arrive, you can watch the sunlight slowly creep down its face, lighting first the brow, then the nose, then the lips. The stone seems to wake in stages, as if remembering something from long ago. The head, recarved or not, is serene. The body, worn and weathered, is ancient in a way that makes 4,500 years seem recent. It's possible that the Sphinx's true age will never be known for certain. The clues are too few, the debates too tangled. But the erosion patterns, the head-body mismatch, the unusual temples, these all tug at the thread of an older story. A story in which the Sphinx stood watch over a Giza we would not recognize, a place of water and green, where a different people carved its form into the bedrock for reasons we can only guess. And if that's the case, then the Sphinx is not just the guardian of the pyramids. It is the guardian of the memory of a lost world, its gaze fixed not just on the rising sun, but on a past we have almost forgotten. If you turn your gaze west from Giza, past the low desert hills, and into the endless shimmer where sand meets sky, it feels like the edge of the world. And for the ancient Egyptians, or whoever came before them, that horizon wasn't just a limit, it was an invitation. Across those waters lay other lands, other peoples, and perhaps other monuments. It might seem strange to connect the pyramids of Egypt with islands far out in the Atlantic, or with structures half a world away, but there are curious threads in the archaeological tapestry that suggest we shouldn't dismiss the idea too quickly. In the Canary Islands, for example, there are stepped pyramid-like structures of uncertain age and purpose. Officially, they're often attributed to more recent agricultural terraces, but their form, and their alignment to the solstices, has led some to wonder if they preserve a memory of older building traditions carried across the sea. Sailors from the old world were not as landlocked as we sometimes imagine. The Nile itself was a gateway to the Mediterranean, and the Mediterranean was a highway. In the days when coastal navigation meant hugging the shore and using the stars as your compass, determined mariners could travel surprising distances. If a pre-dynastic or early maritime culture existed, it's not unthinkable that they might have brought architectural ideas, or even direct expertise, from one shore to another. An authoritative fact, evidence of ancient seafaring in the Mediterranean stretches back at least 8,000 years, including obsidian trade between islands and the mainland. Odd fact, the genetic makeup of some ancient populations in the Canary Islands contains traces suggesting contact with North African peoples thousands of years ago. Historians are still debating whether such contacts were the result of chance voyages or organised expeditions, but the possibility opens an intriguing question. If ideas could cross the sea, could building traditions have done the same? And if the Giza Plateau already had monumental structures in place, could those have inspired, or been inspired by, similar works across the water? Consider also the enigmatic structures on the island of Sardinia. Megalithic towers known as nuraga, built of massive stones without mortar. They date to around 1500 BCE, long after the pyramids, but their construction style echoes the kind of precision stonework seen in places like Giza. The resemblance may be coincidence, or it may be the echo of a shared, much older heritage of stone engineering, passed down and adapted by different cultures over millennia. Even more tantalizing are the similarities in myth. Across North Africa and into the Atlantic islands, there are stories of a lost land or golden age drowned by rising seas. The most famous, of course, is Plato's tale of Atlantis, often dismissed as allegory, yet strangely consistent in certain details with flood myths from distant cultures. Could these be fragmented memories of a real prehistoric maritime network, one that left traces in the form of scattered megaliths? Some fringe theorists imagine an entire seafaring civilization that connected Egypt to far-off coasts long before recorded history. They picture ships larger than anything the Old Kingdom ever launched, sailing from the Nile Delta to the Canary Islands, perhaps even beyond. It's speculative, yes, but the Egyptians themselves left depictions of ocean-going vessels in their art, and some of their buried solar boats are of a size that would be capable of open water travel. If we allow ourselves that possibility, then Giza's pyramids might not have been the isolated achievement of a single culture, but part of a much larger story, a chapter in a book that spans oceans. In this view, the builders could have been participants in a network of exchange that carried not just goods, but ideas, symbols, and architectural concepts from shore to shore. An off-topic but relevant curiosity. In the 1970s, divers off the coast of Yonaguni, Japan, discovered a submerged rock formation that some claim is a man-made stepped pyramid. If it is artificial, a matter still hotly debated, it would suggest that large-scale stone construction has appeared independently, or been shared, across vast distances. While Yonaguni's dating is uncertain, the idea that monumental architecture can appear in many places is a reminder that such skills might travel more easily than we think. Of course, the mainstream explanation for similarities between distant monuments is that human societies everywhere face similar engineering challenges. Big stones, stacked securely, last a long time. The pyramid form is inherently stable, so it arises naturally in different cultures. This is a fair point, but it doesn't explain the occasional oddity. The matching alignments to solstices, the similar ratios in base-to-height measurements, the recurrence of ceremonial causeways and associated temples. These details feel like a signature, repeated across time and space. If there were indeed connections between Egypt and other ancient cultures, we might expect to find more direct evidence, shared tool types, matching inscriptions, genetic links in buried populations. Some of that evidence is sparse but suggestive. Traces of plants and resins native to far-off lands have been found in Egyptian tombs, implying trade routes longer than we thought. Whether those routes existed in the Pyramid era or came later is still uncertain. Imagine for a moment a voyage from the Nile Delta to the Canary Islands in a sturdy wooden ship, guided by the stars and coastal landmarks. The crew arrives in a land of volcanic rock, lush forests and strange animals. They build something familiar on the shore, a stepped platform aligned to the solstice, perhaps for ceremony, perhaps for navigation. Centuries later, the site is abandoned, its meaning forgotten, while across the sea the pyramids remain, keeping their silent watch. In this way, architecture becomes not just a product of place, but a language, a set of ideas that can be carried and adapted. And if the Giza pyramids are the inheritance of an older, possibly maritime-connected culture, then their design may be a dialect of that language, spoken fluently long before Khufu's masons set their first block. The desert hides many things, but so do the oceans. In both realms the past is buried, under dunes of sand or under waves, and sometimes the faintest connection between distant places is enough to remind us that the boundaries we see today were not the same for those who came before. Standing on the plateau, with the wind in your face and the pyramids at your back, you might picture those ancient ships cresting the horizon, their sails swelling with a wind that has blown across oceans since time began. Perhaps their crews came here, walked the same stones, and left a piece of their world behind. If that's true, then the pyramids are not just the heart of Egypt. They are a heartbeat in a network that once spanned far beyond the Nile, pulsing quietly in the deep time before our history began. When you stand close enough to the pyramids to feel their shadow pass over you, it's easy to forget just how much stone you're looking at. Not just the sheer number of blocks, over 2 million for the Great Pyramid alone, but the way each one is cut, shaped, and set with such unnerving precision. It's a kind of precision that prompts a question many visitors have whispered. How exactly were these stones cut and moved? The official answer is that the pyramid builders used copper chisels, dolerite pounders, and stone hammers, aided by sand as an abrasive. They shaped softer limestone with relative ease, and for harder granite they chipped away patiently, sometimes polishing with quartz sand. This explanation is plausible for the casing stones and much of the core. But there are certain pieces, massive granite beams in the king's chamber, or the perfectly smooth basalt paving slabs in nearby temples, that seem to push the limits of those tools. An authoritative fact: the granite used in the Great Pyramid's internal chambers comes from Aswan, nearly 900 kilometers upriver. Transporting blocks weighing up to 70 tons required immense organization, coordination, and manpower. Odd fact: some of the granite beams are finished so smoothly that they appear to have been sawn, with surfaces that display parallel striations not easily explained by pounding or chiseling alone. Historians are still debating whether these marks can be produced with the tools known from the Old Kingdom. Copper saws with quartz sand abrasives could, in theory, cut granite, but experiments show this is an incredibly slow process, measured in millimeters per hour. If every massive beam was cut this way, the time investment would have been staggering, suggesting either a much longer construction period or a far greater workforce than currently estimated. One hypothesis is that the Egyptians, or whoever built these features, used tubular drills tipped with harder materials, possibly corundum. Experimental archaeology has shown that such drills can produce the kind of deep, smooth boreholes occasionally found in ancient granite. But corundum is rare in Egypt, and there is little direct evidence of such tools from the period. Another puzzle is the precision of the joins between some blocks. In parts of the Valley Temple, for example, massive limestone and granite blocks fit together so tightly that a knife blade cannot be inserted between them. The blocks are irregularly shaped, yet the surfaces where they meet are perfectly matched. This kind of fit suggests that the builders shaped each block individually to match its neighbour, a technique seen in megalithic sites in South America, but unusual in Egypt. If you run your fingers along one of these joins, you can feel the strange contradiction. The stone is ancient and weathered, but the craftsmanship is as exact as if it had been machined yesterday. This level of precision invites speculation. Was it purely the product of patience, skill, and countless hours of labour? Or is there a missing piece in our understanding of the techniques involved? An off-topic but related fact: in the ruins of Pumapunku in Bolivia, blocks of andesite stone have been cut with such precision that their edges form perfect right angles, and holes drilled through them are evenly spaced to the millimetre. Mainstream archaeology attributes these to careful hand-carving with stone tools, but the similarity to certain joins in Egypt makes some wonder whether similar techniques or even similar traditions were at work. Returning to Giza, we find another curious detail. In some places, the tool marks don't match what you'd expect from chisels or pounders. They appear more like saw marks, evenly spaced, as if from a blade moving in a rhythmic, controlled motion. Egyptologists often attribute these to repeated strokes with a copper saw and abrasive sand, but to the casual observer, they look like something from a much more recent workshop. There's also the matter of over-engineering. In the king's chamber, the granite beams above the ceiling, part of the relieving chambers designed to reduce weight, are colossal, far heavier than needed to achieve the structural goal. Why use such massive pieces requiring extraordinary effort to transport and place when smaller stones would suffice? Was it a display of power, aesthetic choice, or was it dictated by a construction tradition inherited from an earlier time when different tools and techniques made such choices routine? Historians are still debating whether the pyramids were built in one continuous effort or in multiple phases. If there were earlier phases, perhaps the precision-cut granite beams were remnants from an earlier monument, repurposed by the later builders. This might explain why certain elements seem out of step with the overall technology of the Old Kingdom. Imagine watching the work in progress, not from the neat scenes painted on tomb walls, but from the real plateau. Dust hangs in the air, wooden sledges groan under the weight of granite blocks, hauled by teams of men across slickened tracks. At the quarry, someone is cutting into a block with a copper saw, the sand grinding between metal and stone, the sound like a low, steady rasp. It's slow, back-breaking work, and yet, scattered among these scenes of brute force, you might notice moments of inexplicable efficiency. Cuts too clean, surfaces too perfect. Could it be that the builders had access to a small set of techniques or tools that were later lost? Not high technology in the modern sense, but specialized knowledge of materials and methods that gave them a precision we find hard to match with the same tools today. Such knowledge could have been passed down from a much earlier building tradition, one that was already fading by the time the Egyptians of the 4th dynasty undertook their grand projects. One of the strangest pieces of this puzzle comes from the basalt pavement south of the Great Pyramid. These huge flat slabs are not only perfectly level, but they also bear marks suggesting they were shaped with a consistent sweeping motion, something not easily replicated with hand tools. Their purpose is uncertain. They may have formed the floor of a courtyard or temple, but their quality is so high that, like the granite beams, they stand apart from the bulk of construction work at Giza. If you view the pyramid complex as a palimpsest, a surface that has been written on, erased, and written on again, then the precision-cut granite and basalt could be the oldest text, with later additions and repairs layered on top. In this sense, the pyramids we see today are a blend of different technological moments, some fitting neatly into the Old Kingdom, others hinting at a forgotten chapter. The stone does not give up its secrets easily. You can measure it, photograph it, even scan it with lasers, and still not know exactly how the work was done. But if you listen closely while you run your hand over a perfectly matched joint or a polished granite face, you might feel an echo of the hands that made it. Hands that may have belonged to Egyptians, or to someone who was here long before them. In the shadow of the pyramids, a wooden vessel rests in silence, or rather, its pieces do, disassembled, carefully stored in a pit for thousands of years, waiting for a future it could never have imagined. This is the Khufu ship, one of the most remarkable finds in the entire Giza complex, and it changes the way we think about the people connected to these monuments. Discovered in 1954 in a sealed chamber beside the Great Pyramid, the Khufu ship is a full-sized 43-metre-long cedar vessel, built with a level of craftsmanship that still impresses modern shipwrights. It was designed without nails or metal fasteners. Instead, its planks were sewn together with rope in a method known as lashed plank construction. This technique gives the hull flexibility, important for ocean swells, and suggests that the builders understood the challenges of long-distance travel. An authoritative fact: the cedar used for the Khufu ship came from Lebanon, over 800 kilometres away, meaning the material was imported through a well-organised trade network. Odd fact: the design of the ship is seaworthy, not just river-worthy. Though officially labelled a solar bark meant for ritual use, its hull shape, construction and durability are consistent with vessels intended for open water. Historians are still debating whether the Khufu ship ever touched the Nile's waters. Some argue it was purely symbolic, meant to carry the pharaoh's soul across the celestial river in the afterlife. Others note that its design is too practical, too robust, to be purely ceremonial. Could it be a functional copy of a real seafaring ship, one used in life before being buried in death? If so, then the people who built the Great Pyramid were not landlocked artisans chained to their quarries. They were connected through river and sea to a broader world. They could import timber from distant lands, navigate long coastlines, and perhaps even cross open stretches of the Mediterranean. That raises an intriguing question. If they could reach Lebanon for cedar, where else might they have gone? Imagine a ship like this setting out from the Nile Delta, its sail catching the steady trade winds that sweep across the sea. The crew watches the coastline slip away, steering by the stars. Days later, they land on a rocky shore, perhaps Cyprus, Crete, or even beyond, bringing with them not just goods, but stories, techniques, and ideas. A ship is not just a means of transport, it's a bridge between worlds. This maritime capability could also help explain how certain construction techniques, or even the idea of monumental stone building, might have travelled. If Egypt inherited the pyramids from an earlier culture, perhaps that culture had connections across the water, connections that left faint traces in distant megalithic sites. Conversely, if the Egyptians themselves were the originators, their ships could have carried their influence far beyond the Nile. There's also the mystery of why ships were buried at all. The Khufu ship is not alone. Several other pits around the pyramids contain boat remains, or are thought to have once held them. In some cases, these are much smaller craft, likely symbolic. But burying full-size ships beside a pyramid is a massive investment of labour and resources. Was it truly for the pharaoh's journey in the afterlife? Or was it a way of preserving something sacred, a craft that had been used in life for a purpose too important to forget? An off-topic but curious detail. The Khufu ship's planks were joined without the use of metal nails, despite copper being available. This was a common practice in seafaring cultures far from Egypt. Polynesia, for example, where lashed construction allowed boats to flex in heavy seas. Could it be coincidence? Or does it suggest that certain shipbuilding techniques have a way of spreading across oceans carried by sailors themselves? The cedar timbers of the Khufu ship also tell a story of longevity. Dendrochronological studies suggest the wood was already seasoned before the ship was built, meaning it could have been reused from an earlier vessel or structure. If that's true, then the ship buried beside Khufu's pyramid might have been constructed from materials that had already seen service, perhaps on voyages whose destinations we can only imagine. The connection between the pyramids and these ships becomes even more intriguing when you remember that the Nile itself was much closer to the Giza plateau in ancient times. Canals or river branches could have brought large vessels right up to the construction site. It's easy to picture ships unloading granite from Aswan or limestone from Tura. But what if some of these ships came from much farther away? Their cargo not just stone but knowledge. Historians are still debating whether the Khufu ship was meant to be a replica of a specific vessel from the king's lifetime. If it was, and if that vessel had ever sailed beyond the Nile, then the pyramid story becomes one of maritime as well as monumental achievement. This possibility nudges us toward a more connected vision of the ancient world, one where great monuments on land are linked to equally great journeys at sea. And if we push the speculation further, we could imagine an earlier, perhaps pre-Egyptian culture using ships like these to travel between centres of monumental building. The same people who aligned the pyramids to the stars could have followed those same stars across the horizon, finding other shores where their style and skill took root. Standing beside the restored Khufu ship today, it's hard not to see it as a physical metaphor for the pyramid itself. Both are extraordinary works of engineering, both required resources from far afield, and both were designed to endure. And just as the pyramid points upward to the sky, the ship points outward to the horizon. A reminder that Egypt's story was never only about the desert. If the pyramids were inherited from an earlier civilization, then perhaps the ships buried beside them were too, heirlooms from a time when the builders were also voyagers, carrying their culture not just along the Nile, but across the waters of the known and unknown world. Maps are strange things. On the surface, they seem like simple tools, lines on parchment to help you get from one place to another. But maps also tell you what the maker knew, and sometimes what they weren't supposed to know. When it comes to the pyramids, there's an unexpected twist in this story. There are ancient and early, modern maps that seem to contain knowledge of landscapes no one in their supposed time should have possessed. The most famous example is the Piri Reis map, drawn in 1513 by an Ottoman admiral who claimed to have based it on ancient maps now lost. Most people know the Piri Reis map because of its controversial depiction of the South American coastline and what some interpret as an ice-free Antarctica. But buried in the details is another curiosity. Its depiction of the African coast, including the Nile Delta, is unusually accurate for the era. An authoritative fact: in the early 16th century, European and Ottoman navigators were still refining their knowledge of African coastlines through exploration. Odd fact: certain stretches of the Piri Reis map align more closely with modern satellite measurements than with the cartographic standards of its own time. Historians are still debating whether this accuracy is the result of luck, skill, or the use of much older source material. If Piri Reis truly drew on ancient charts, then we have to ask, who made those charts, and how did they know the terrain so well? If there was an advanced surveying tradition in antiquity, could it have been connected to the builders, or inheritors, of the Giza pyramids? Other maps too have stirred whispers. The Boachi map from the 18th century depicts a hypothetical ice-free Antarctica, complete with river valleys now hidden under miles of ice. While mainstream science attributes this to speculation rather than ancient knowledge, some fringe researchers suggest it could echo prehistoric surveys, preserved through copies and reinterpretations over millennia. What do maps have to do with pyramids? More than you might think. To place the pyramids with their astonishing accuracy, aligned almost perfectly to the cardinal points and to certain celestial features, you need surveying skill. Surveying is, in essence, map-making. If the original builders possessed such skill, perhaps they applied it not just to monuments, but to entire landscapes. An off-topic but fascinating fact. In 1978, a study of the Giza Plateau's layout suggested that the pyramids are positioned not only with astronomical alignments in mind, but also in relation to the natural topography in ways that would be nearly impossible without a large-scale plan. It's as if the builders had a mental, or perhaps physical map of the area, one that allowed them to integrate natural and cosmic references into a single coherent design. Now imagine a civilization capable of charting the Nile Valley in detail, mapping the courses of rivers, the positions of hills, even the shifting shoreline of the Mediterranean. That kind of mapping skill could serve in construction, agriculture, navigation, and in the creation of monuments aligned with both earth and sky. If such knowledge predates the dynastic Egyptians, it might also have been portable. Sailors could carry it to other lands where it would slowly be transformed, distorted, and finally rediscovered in maps like Piri Reis's. There's another dimension to this idea. Many ancient sites around the world, Giza among them, are located in positions that some researchers believe correspond to a kind of global grid, a network of geodesic lines connecting monuments, mountain peaks, and sacred sites. Mainstream archaeologists usually dismiss this as coincidence, noting that with enough points on a globe you can draw many lines. But if you accept the possibility that an ancient culture had advanced surveying and navigation abilities, the idea becomes less far-fetched. Perhaps the pyramids were one node in a much larger interconnected system. In this view, the pyramids are not isolated tombs but markers, part of a prehistoric mapping project on a planetary scale. The motivation could have been religious, scientific, or both. For a society attuned to cycles of the sun, moon, and stars, mapping the Earth might have been a way to reflect the order of the heavens. If that sounds abstract, consider how the Egyptians themselves linked geography and myth. The Nile was the earthly counterpart of the Milky Way. Sacred sites were chosen for their relation to the landscape and the sky. If the Egyptians inherited Giza's layout, they may have also inherited its underlying map logic, even if they no longer understood its original purpose. One hypothesis is that the original builders used a surveying method involving long-distance triangulation, aligning points over many miles using sighting markers or elevated platforms. This would require a knowledge of geometry, a steady measuring baseline, and precise instruments. In the modern era, such accuracy usually demands advanced optics, but clever ancient engineers could have achieved surprising precision with simple tools, given enough time and discipline. Standing on the plateau, you can test this idea yourself. Pick a fixed point on the horizon and align it with the corner of a pyramid. Walk a straight line away, keeping the alignment perfect. Now imagine doing this across miles, with markers visible from hilltop to hilltop. Over time, you could map an entire region and place monuments with uncanny accuracy. An off-topic curiosity: the Great Pyramid's base is so level that it varies by less than an inch across its 13-acre footprint. To achieve this, the builders must have had a precise reference plane. Some researchers think they used water-filled trenches as a leveling tool, essentially creating a giant spirit level thousands of years before the invention of the bubble level. If true, this is yet another hint that the builders combined practical ingenuity with a deep understanding of measurement. If they could level a monument with such precision, they could certainly map a coastline or a river delta. And if they could map those, perhaps they could also chart the positions of stars with equal care, weaving together the Earth's contours and the sky's patterns into a single grand design. The idea that fragments of these ancient maps survived, only to be rediscovered centuries later, is enticing. It connects the tangible, the blocks of the pyramids, with the intangible, knowledge passed down, altered, and half forgotten. If even a sliver of that knowledge reached the hands of the later navigators, it might explain why certain early maps seem to know more than they should. So perhaps the pyramids are more than markers of a specific pharaoh's ambition. Perhaps they are points on a prehistoric chart, a map you can only read if you know the code, a code written in stone and visible from the stars. If the pyramids are the visible peaks of Giza's mystery, then the Hall of Records is the legend that lurks just beneath the sand. It is a story that refuses to die, whispered in books, documentaries, and late-night conversations. Somewhere under the paws of the Sphinx, or deep beneath the plateau itself, lies a sealed chamber containing the lost knowledge of a forgotten civilization. The Hall of Records first gained international attention through the writings of Edgar Cayce, the so-called sleeping prophet, in the early 20th century. In his trance readings, Cayce claimed that survivors of a cataclysmic disaster, often identified with Atlantis, brought their wisdom to Egypt and stored it in a hidden vault. This repository, he said, contained the history of humanity from the beginning of time, along with the science and technology of the ancients. According to Cayce, the vault would be discovered in the late 20th century. That deadline has long passed without any public revelation, but the allure of the idea remains. Historians are still debating whether the legend is entirely a modern invention or whether it has older roots in Egyptian mythology. Ancient texts do refer to hidden repositories of knowledge, scrolls kept in temple archives, secret books of Thoth buried beneath the earth, but these are usually described in symbolic terms. An authoritative fact: there are indeed voids and anomalies under and around the Sphinx detected through seismic surveys in the 1990s. Odd fact: some of these anomalies are rectangular and positioned in ways that suggest man-made structures, but they have never been fully excavated or examined in public view. Egyptian authorities have often stated that these voids are natural features in the bedrock, and yet the secrecy surrounding certain surveys, coupled with the Sphinx's already enigmatic history, has fueled speculation. Could these be nothing more than fissures and cavities, or are they part of an older construction hidden beneath the visible monuments? One hypothesis is that the so-called Hall of Records might not be a literal library of scrolls and tablets, but a metaphor for encoded knowledge. Perhaps the monuments themselves are the records, with their alignments, dimensions, and materials preserving information in a form we have yet to fully decode. This interpretation fits neatly with the idea of the pyramids as a kind of ancient hard drive for astronomical and geodetic data. An off-topic but intriguing fact: in 1997, a Japanese team conducted a remote sensing survey around the Sphinx and reported a series of underground anomalies leading toward the Great Pyramid. These findings were never followed up with official excavations, at least not publicly. Whether that's due to lack of evidence, bureaucratic caution, or something more deliberate is anyone's guess. If we entertain the possibility of a literal hidden chamber, the question becomes who built it and why. If the pyramids were inherited from an earlier civilization, the chamber could have been part of their original design, a place to safeguard their history against the erosion of time and the rise and fall of nations. The dry climate of Egypt would be ideal for preserving delicate materials, and the sheer mass of the surrounding stone would deter looters. But if the Egyptians themselves created it, perhaps it was less about preserving history and more about sealing away sacred or dangerous knowledge. Ancient cultures often treated certain texts, rituals, or objects as too potent for general use, locking them away for the benefit or protection of future generations. Imagining the Hall of Records is easy. Picture a long corridor descending into cool darkness, the air growing still as you step further down. The walls are smooth, their surfaces covered in faint carvings, constellations, geometric diagrams, and scripts no one can read. At the end of the corridor, a great stone door sits sealed, its joints so perfect you cannot see the seam. Behind it, shelves hold scrolls of papyrus, clay tablets, even objects of unknown material. In the flicker of your torch, gold glints in the shadows. It's a romantic vision, but perhaps too neat. If such a chamber exists, it might not be an organised library at all. It could be a jumbled collection of objects, statues, tools, pieces of technology, placed there hurriedly in the face of some disaster. Or it could be empty, cleared out in antiquity, its contents scattered to the winds of history. Historians are still debating whether it's worth the risk to excavate near the Sphinx, given the monument's fragility. Digging in the wrong place could destabilise the structure, and so, for now, the anomalies remain undisturbed, their secrets intact. But the persistence of the Hall of Records legend tells us something important. Humans are drawn to the idea that the answers to our greatest mysteries are hidden, waiting to be found. It is the same impulse that drives us to explore tombs, dive to shipwrecks, and decode ancient scripts. The pyramids themselves are a kind of hall of records, open to the sky, yet still withholding their full story. An off-topic curiosity: some fringe researchers believe that the records are not underground at all, but hidden in plain sight within the architecture of the pyramids. They point to ratios in the dimensions that encode the size of the Earth, the length of the year, and the distances to celestial bodies. If that's true, then the vault is the pyramid itself, and we've been walking past it for centuries without realizing it. Whether real or symbolic, the Hall of Records concept fits perfectly into the larger idea of Giza as an inherited site. If the pyramids are the monuments of an earlier civilization, then somewhere, perhaps underground, might be the key to understanding who they were. And until that key is found, we are left to keep guessing, tracing the lines of the visible in hopes they will lead us to the hidden. Standing at the Sphinx's paws, with the massive limestone blocks rising on either side, you might find yourself staring at the ground, wondering if a door lies just beneath your feet. Maybe it's only stone all the way down, or maybe, a few meters below, history waits in the dark, untouched for thousands of years. Stone can tell you a story, but so can mud and silt and the invisible traces of ancient weather locked deep beneath the earth. If you want to chase the pyramid's history beyond what the eye can see, you have to leave the monuments behind for a moment and look to something more humble: the climate data buried in Egypt's landscape. Because in a way, The land remembers what we've forgotten. We know from geological and paleo-environmental studies that North Africa has not always been the desert it is today. Around 10,000 to 5,000 years ago, the Sahara was green. Rainfall was abundant, lakes and rivers stretched across the region, and the Nile itself swelled with seasonal floods that made its valley an even richer lifeline than in later dynastic times. This was the African humid period, a climatic phase that turned much of what is now barren sand into grassland, forest and wetland. An authoritative fact: sediment cores from ancient lake beds in the Sahara show pollen from species that could only survive in wetter climates. Trees like acacias and sycamores, grasses now found hundreds of kilometres away. Odd fact: hippo bones have been found in archaeological layers near the Giza plateau, suggesting that these massive river animals once wallowed close to the site. Historians are still debating how this green Sahara affected human settlement patterns, but it's clear that the wetter climate would have supported larger, more stable populations. If the pyramids, or their foundations, were first built during this period, the builders would have enjoyed resources unthinkable in the arid Egypt we know today: abundant water, timber for scaffolding, and fertile fields to feed a workforce year-round. And that leads to a compelling thought. The erosion patterns on monuments like the Sphinx might not be outliers at all, but normal for structures built in a wetter environment. The rounded, vertical channels carved into the limestone by centuries of rain could be relics of a time when the plateau saw seasonal storms rather than sandblasting winds. To test this, researchers have studied ancient shorelines, fossilized riverbeds, and the microscopic shells of diatoms, tiny aquatic organisms preserved in sediment layers. These data points allow scientists to reconstruct rainfall patterns and river flows going back thousands of years. The picture they paint is clear. Egypt was wetter, and for a long time. Then, around 5,000 years ago, the climate shifted abruptly. The monsoons retreated southward, rainfall plummeted, and the Sahara began its transformation into desert. This timeline overlaps in an interesting way with Egypt's own history. The drying climate would have pushed people toward the Nile Valley, concentrating populations and spurring the development of more complex societies. But if the pyramids were older than the Old Kingdom, the climate shift could also explain why their original builders disappeared, forced to abandon their monumental projects as the environment turned hostile. An off-topic but fascinating fact: certain ancient Egyptian depictions of the Nile show papyrus marshes and flocks of birds in densities that no longer exist there. Some Egyptologists think these are artistic exaggerations. Others suspect they are faithful memories of a greener time, perhaps passed down for centuries in cultural memory. Imagine standing on the Giza plateau in the middle of the African humid period. The air is heavy with the scent of wet earth. You can hear the calls of waterfowl and the distant rumble of a summer storm. The Nile, swollen from recent rains, glitters in the low sun. From this vantage point, the idea of hauling massive stones into place doesn't seem like the impossible desert ordeal we imagine today. There's wood for sledges and rollers, water to lubricate the transport paths, and food to sustain a large workforce. The plateau itself might even have been dotted with patches of greenery. If we take this scenario seriously, then the pyramid's scale makes more sense. Building them in today's climate would require massive logistical planning just to keep workers alive. Building them in a wetter era would have been hard work, yes, but far more feasible. This doesn't mean the dynastic Egyptians couldn't have done it in a desert. They clearly accomplished impressive engineering feats under arid conditions. But it does open the door to an earlier phase of construction, one in which nature provided more of the resources. Historians are still debating whether traces of this wetter period can be seen in other Old Kingdom monuments. At some temples, blocks show patterns of surface dissolution consistent with exposure to rainfall over centuries. At others, the foundations rest on what appears to be old river sediment, as though the buildings were erected on the site of an earlier floodplain. The climate theory also has implications for the debate over quarry marks and toolware. If stone was being cut in a wetter climate, the quarry faces would have been softer, more susceptible to weathering. This could explain why some ancient tool marks look faint or eroded in ways that seem inconsistent with their supposed age. An off-topic curiosity. In 2018, a team studying stalagmites in Egyptian caves used their growth rings to reconstruct a 140,000-year climate record. They found clear evidence of abrupt shifts between wet and dry phases. This shows just how dynamic Egypt's climate has been over deep time, and how possible it is that human cultures rose and fell in response to these swings long before the pharaohs. If we imagine that the pyramid's first stones were laid in the Green Sahara era, it casts the whole Giza complex in a different light. The monuments would not have been isolated in a sea of sand, but integrated into a living, fertile landscape, perhaps even part of a broader ceremonial network that included river processions, lakeside temples, and agricultural festivals. When the climate shifted, the builders, or their descendants, might have clung to the Nile Valley, adapting the old monuments to new purposes. Over time, the origin story could have been rewritten, crediting the structures to the reigning kings of the New Age. By the time Khufu, Khafre and Menkaure ruled, the plateau might already have been ancient, its original context lost beneath layers of sand and centuries. Today, as you look out from the plateau toward the hazy horizon, it's hard to picture that lush past. But the land remembers, even if we don't. The pollen grains trapped in buried soil, the grooves carved by vanished rains, the bones of animals that no longer roam here. They're all pieces of a larger truth, and that truth might be telling us that the pyramid story began not in the desert, but in a world of rivers, storms, and green. Above the king's chamber in the Great Pyramid lies one of the most curious and contentious features in all of Egyptology, the so-called relieving chambers. To the casual visitor, they are invisible, hidden far above the main burial space. But for those who study the pyramid's internal structure, these cramped stone lofts have become a focal point for debates about authenticity, purpose, and even the origins of the monument itself. When you walk into the king's chamber, the first thing you notice is the granite. Enormous blocks forming the floor, walls and ceiling. Each ceiling beam is a single slab weighing up to 70 tons, hauled from the quarries of Aswan, nearly 900 kilometers away. These beams span the chamber without visible sag or crack, which is impressive enough. But it's what's above them that adds another layer to the puzzle. Stacked over the chamber are 5 small spaces, each separated by more colossal granite beams. Officially, these are called relieving chambers because they're meant to deflect the immense weight of the pyramid above, preventing it from crushing the king's chamber. In principle, it works like a primitive load-bearing system. By breaking the weight into separate layers, the stress is distributed sideways into the pyramid's mass. An authoritative fact: the relieving chambers were first accessed in 1837 by British explorer Howard Vyse, who blasted his way upward from the Grand Gallery using gunpowder. Odd fact: inside these chambers, Vyse found red paint markings, hieroglyphs naming Khufu, along with work gang graffiti. These inscriptions are often cited as proof that Khufu was the pyramid's builder, but their discovery has been shadowed by whispers of forgery, a controversy that refuses to die. Historians are still debating the authenticity of these markings. Vyse's notes describe how they were found in difficult-to-reach spaces, making deliberate placement by modern hands improbable. Yet some researchers point out inconsistencies in the hieroglyphic forms, suggesting they may have been copied imperfectly from known examples. If the markings were added later, whether by ancient restorers or 19th century hands, it would complicate the narrative that the pyramid was definitively built under Khufu. Even setting aside the inscriptions, the relieving chambers themselves raise questions. Were they purely functional, or were they part of an earlier design, later adapted by Khufu's architects? The sheer size and precision of the granite beams suggest a mastery of quarrying and transport that would have been a colossal undertaking even for a culture at the height of its power. If these beams were already in place before Khufu's time, they could represent a surviving fragment of an older monument incorporated into the 4th Dynasty project. An off-topic but related curiosity: the ratio of the king's chamber's dimensions has been interpreted by some as encoding mathematical constants like pi and the golden ratio. While many mainstream archaeologists dismiss this as numerological coincidence, others wonder if the dimensions were deliberately chosen to reflect principles known to the builders, whether Egyptian or pre-Egyptian. There's also the question of why 5 relieving chambers were used. 3 or even 2 could have sufficed to reduce the load. Was the extra work a belt and suspenders approach by cautious engineers, or was there another reason for the repetition? Some have suggested that these upper spaces may have had ceremonial or symbolic meaning, perhaps aligning with celestial or numerical themes now lost to us. When modern researchers scan the pyramid using muon tomography, a technique that detects cosmic particles passing through stone, they can see these spaces clearly. But in 2017, such scans revealed something unexpected: an even larger, previously unknown void above the Grand Gallery, separate from the relieving chambers. Its purpose is unknown, and Egypt's antiquities, authorities have not yet opened it for exploration. Could it be another functional load-bearing space, or something else entirely, perhaps left over from an earlier construction phase? Imagine for a moment that the relieving chambers and their massive granite beams were not designed for the king's chamber at all. Picture them as the surviving core of a different structure, one that stood on this plateau before the pyramid's current form was conceived. The later builders, whether Khufu's or someone else's, might have incorporated these granite lofts into their design, because dismantling them would have been impractical. In that case, the chambers would be like the foundation of an older building hidden inside a newer one. An authoritative geological observation: the granite beams in the relieving chambers show no quarry marks visible in the accessible surfaces, suggesting they were dressed elsewhere before being placed. This implies a staging process far from the pyramid site, adding yet another layer of logistical complexity. Odd fact: the grooves cut into some beams match no known Old Kingdom lifting technique, as though they were shaped for tools or methods no longer in use by Khufu's time. Historians are still debating whether the construction of the relieving chambers required scaffolding or internal ramps. Both methods present challenges. Scaffolding would have been difficult to anchor inside the narrow confines of the pyramid, while ramps would have needed to be removed after the beams were set, leaving little room for error. If these chambers were built earlier, perhaps in an open-air context before the pyramid's superstructure enclosed them, their construction would have been much easier, another point in favour of the inheritance hypothesis. An off-topic curiosity worth noting: in some other ancient monuments worldwide, large granite beams are used in positions where their size and strength far exceed the structural demands, much like here. This has led some researchers to speculate that in certain traditions, megalithic engineering was as much about prestige and display as about function. To move and place such enormous stones was to demonstrate mastery over nature itself, a kind of cultural boast. Whether functional, symbolic, or inherited, the relieving chambers add another layer to the enigma of the Great Pyramid. If Khufu built them, his engineers displayed a level of planning and execution that stands among the greatest achievements in architectural history. If he did not, then he, or his predecessors, managed to appropriate a feat from an earlier age, integrating it so seamlessly into their own work that it remains one of the most impressive interior designs ever attempted. Standing in the dim light of the king's chamber today, it's hard to sense what lies above. You have to climb narrow ladders and crawl through hot, dusty shafts to reach the relieving chambers. Once inside, the air is heavy, and the granite beams seem to press down not just with their weight, but with the weight of untold centuries. If the red paint markings are genuine, they connect you directly to the crews who hauled and placed these stones. If they're not, they hint at a mystery even deeper, one where names were assigned after the fact and the true builders remain anonymous. and perhaps that's the most unsettling part. The chambers are real. The granite is real. The markings, whatever their origin, are real. But the story we've wrapped around them is still only a theory. The stone doesn't confirm or deny it. It simply endures, as it has for thousands of years, waiting for us to decide which version of the past we will believe. When the Greek historian Herodotus visited Egypt around 450 BCE, the pyramids were already ancient, older to him than the ruins of Rome are to us. He stood on the Giza plateau and listened to local guides recount their origins, and he dutifully wrote it all down. His account, preserved in the histories, remains one of the most famous ancient descriptions of the pyramids. But as with all travel stories, you have to wonder, how much of what he heard was fact, and how much was legend? Herodotus claimed that the Great Pyramid was built over a period of 20 years, employing a vast labour force of 100,000 men, rotated in shifts. He wrote about causeways leading from the quarries to the pyramid, about underground chambers, and about a complex of canals that may have brought the Nile's waters close to the site. He even recorded that the pyramid was inscribed with characters detailing the amount of food provided to the workers, a staggering quantity of radishes, onions and garlic. An authoritative fact. Herodotus's account is the earliest known detailed narrative about the pyramids from a foreign observer. Odd fact. Some of his descriptions contradict archaeological evidence. For instance, he states that the pyramid's casing stones bore inscriptions, but no such markings have been found on the surviving blocks. Historians are still debating whether Herodotus's guides were giving him a faithful version of Egyptian oral history, or embellishing the story for the benefit of a curious outsider. It's possible that the Egyptians of his time didn't actually know the full truth themselves. By the 5th century BCE, more than 2 millennia had passed since the 4th dynasty. Kings had come and gone, dynasties had risen and fallen, and the memory of how the pyramids were truly built might have been replaced with a mixture of fact, tradition, and convenient myth. One of Herodotus's most tantalizing claims is that the Great Pyramid was built on a foundation of stone blocks laid over an artificial hill containing underground chambers. This description resonates with modern findings of subterranean anomalies beneath the pyramid, though whether he was describing an actual observation or repeating a legend is unknown. An off-topic, curiosity. Herodotus also recorded stories about labyrinthine structures elsewhere in Egypt, such as the vast complex at Hawara, which he claimed was more impressive than the pyramids themselves. Archaeology confirms that a labyrinth-like mortuary temple once stood there, though much of it is now lost. The parallels raise the question of how many other monumental works have vanished entirely, leaving only the pyramids as survivors from a broader tradition. If Herodotus was misled, or if his informants themselves were working from incomplete knowledge, it could mean that by his time, the pyramid's true origins were already a matter of debate. The official story, whatever it was, may have been shaped as much by politics as by history. This is not unique to Egypt. In many cultures, rulers have rewritten the past to strengthen their legitimacy, often claiming ancient monuments as their own creations. One hypothesis is that the Egyptians of Herodotus's era genuinely believed Khufu built the Great Pyramid because his name appeared in association with it in temple inscriptions, or because it fit the narrative they'd been taught. Over centuries, such attribution would have solidified into fact, regardless of whether it was accurate. This is similar to how medieval Europeans attributed megalithic monuments to the Romans, even when they were much older. There's another layer here too. Herodotus's account is one of the main sources for the image of pyramid construction involving vast armies of slaves. Modern archaeology has overturned this, showing that the workers were skilled labourers, often well-fed, and living in purpose-built workers' villages near the plateau. Yet the slave labour myth persisted for centuries, in part because Herodotus's writings were so influential. If something so fundamental could be misunderstood, what else in his narrative might be wrong? An off-topic but telling detail, Herodotus claimed that the pyramids were built stepwise, and then finished from the top down. This is consistent with what we know about step pyramid construction methods, but it's also vague enough to apply to multiple possible techniques. It's possible that he was looking at the weathered, stepped appearance of the unfinished pyramid of Menkaure and projecting that process backward onto the others. Imagine Herodotus standing at Giza, notebook in hand, surrounded by locals eager to impress the learned visitor from Greece. Some tell him about Khufu's tyranny, others about the grandeur of the construction, others still about hidden chambers and secret canals. He writes it all, not knowing that future generations will take his words as gospel or as evidence of his gullibility. Historians are still debating the degree to which ancient travellers like Herodotus could separate fact from propaganda. Without modern dating methods, they had to rely on observation, hearsay, and their own cultural assumptions. If the Egyptians, he spoke to were themselves repeating a legend about inheriting the pyramids from an earlier age. Herodotus might have been the first in a long chain of historians to pass that legend down to us. One of his more peculiar claims is that the Great Pyramid was built upon steps and with machines made of short pieces of wood that lifted the stones from step to step. No one knows exactly what he meant by machines. Some take it as ramps, others imagine lever devices. The fact that he uses the term at all hints at a building technology that may have been unusual or unfamiliar to his Greek audience, perhaps even something that had already fallen out of use in Egypt by his time. If we view Herodotus' account not as a blueprint, but as a snapshot of the pyramid's reputation in the 5th century BCE, it becomes a valuable piece of the puzzle. It shows us how the monument was understood, or misunderstood, long before modern archaeology tried to reconstruct its story. It also reminds us that the pyramid's mystery is not just about how they were built, but about how they were remembered. Standing where Herodotus once stood, you can feel the same mixture of awe and curiosity he must have felt. The stones are silent, the desert wind loud in your ears. You can write down what the guides tell you, but whether you've been handed truth, myth, or a careful blend of both, that's something you may never know. Before the desert claimed the plateau, before Cairo's sprawl crept to its edge, Giza may have been something entirely different. A green rise above a world that would be unrecognizable to us. In the African humid period, the Sahara was alive. Where now there are dunes, there were lakes. Where now there are dust storms, there were rains that fell for weeks. The pyramids, if they existed then, would not have looked like islands in a sea of sand. They would have been set like jewels in a living landscape. Geological evidence shows that between about 10,000 and 5,000 years ago, monsoon rains reached deep into what is now desert. This wasn't just a little more rain than today. It was enough to fill massive lakes, some the size of small seas. Satellite imagery has revealed the ghostly outlines of these ancient waters, along with river channels long since dry. Some of those channels point toward the Nile and the Giza Plateau. An authoritative fact: sediment cores taken from deep beneath the Sahara, show layers of freshwater mollusk shells, pollen from wetland plants, and organic material consistent with a lush environment. Odd fact: in 2001, archaeologists discovered prehistoric rock art deep in the desert showing people swimming, scenes painted thousands of years before the first dynastic pharaohs. Historians are still debating how this Green Sahara affected the development of civilizations along the Nile. One camp sees it as a prelude to the unification of Egypt. As the rains ended and the desert advanced, people were forced into the Nile Valley, creating denser populations and more complex societies. Another camp suggests that the Green Sahara could have supported advanced cultures of its own, now almost entirely erased except for scattered archaeological traces. If the pyramid's earlier stones were placed in this wet era, the environmental context changes everything about how we imagine their construction. In a greener Giza, the builders would have had access to wood for sledges and scaffolding, abundant food for workers, and water for transport. Moving multi-ton blocks across damp, grassy plains or along water channels is a very different task than dragging them over dry sand under a scorching sun. The plateau itself might have been chosen not for its stark isolation, but for its commanding view over fertile floodplains and nearby waterways. Imagine processions moving along canals or rivers, the pyramids reflecting in the water. The monuments might have been as much a part of a living cityscape as a desert necropolis. An off-topic but striking observation. In 2010, researchers studying fossilized pollen from the Nile Delta found abrupt shifts in vegetation types around 5,000 years ago, consistent with a rapid climate change event. Such a sudden shift would have been catastrophic for agriculture and could have driven mass migrations, potentially explaining the disappearance of any pre-dynastic culture that might have built on the Giza plateau. If this earlier climate was the stage for the pyramids' beginnings, it would also explain some puzzling erosion patterns. Heavy, seasonal rains could have weathered limestone in ways we now only see in wetter climates. The rounded channels and deep fissures on certain stones, especially around the Sphinx enclosure, make far more sense in a rainy environment than in the hyper-arid Egypt of the last several thousand years. It's also worth noting that wetter climates mean more than just easier building conditions. They mean greater connectivity. Lakes and rivers act as highways. In the green Sahara, water routes could have connected regions that are now separated by hundreds of miles of barren sand. Such a network could have facilitated the movement not just of goods, but of ideas and architectural traditions. Historians are still debating whether the abrupt desertification around 3000 BCE was a gradual decline or a sudden collapse. Either way, the change would have been dramatic. Within a few generations, communities that had thrived on fishing, farming and river trade would have been forced to abandon their homes. If the Giza Plateau's monuments were already ancient at this point, they might have been left deserted, to be rediscovered centuries later by a different people, the ones we now call the ancient Egyptians. An off-topic curiosity. In the 1990s, archaeologists found a series of megalithic stone circles at Nabta Playa, deep in the southern Egyptian desert dating to around 7,000 years ago. These stones align with the summer solstice and suggest a sophisticated understanding of astronomy, long before the pyramid's supposed construction. Could Nabta Playa and Giza be distant echoes of the same early tradition, born in the fertile Sahara? If so, then the pyramids could represent the culmination of a building style and astronomical alignment practice that began far earlier than the Old Kingdom. In this interpretation, Khufu and his contemporaries were not inventing something new. They were reviving, expanding, and claiming as their own a tradition that reached back into the deep prehistory of North Africa. Imagine the psychological impact of inheriting such monuments. You live in a world turning to desert, yet here on the plateau stand vast structures, perfectly aligned, impervious to the shifting sands. You might see them as gifts from the gods, or as proof of a golden age now gone. Your rulers might decide to incorporate them into their own religious and political systems, attaching their names to the stones to assert continuity with that ancient greatness. From this perspective, the pyramid's survival into the desert era isn't just a matter of engineering, it's a matter of luck. Built in a time of plenty, they endured because of their sheer mass and durable materials, while the softer, more vulnerable structures of their builders were erased by sand and wind. The fact that we still see them at all might be a historical accident, a trick of geology and climate. Today, standing on the plateau, you can barely imagine the sound of rain on stone here. But if the climate evidence is correct, that sound once echoed across this place. The pyramids, whether new or already old, would have glistened with water, their surfaces reflecting flashes of lightning from storms rolling in off the savannah. It's a vision so alien to our image of Egypt that it almost feels like another planet, and yet it may be the world in which the pyramid story truly began. If the green Sahara once fed the builders' needs, the next question becomes, where did those builders come from? The Old Kingdom narrative insists they were Egyptians, organised, loyal, and labouring under the will of pharaohs. But if the pyramids predate that order, their makers might have been members of a culture entirely separate from dynastic Egypt, a people whose homeland has since been erased by the desert. Archaeological hints suggest that long before the unification of Upper and Lower Egypt, there were peoples in North Africa skilled in working stone on a monumental scale. We have little more than tantalizing fragments, megalithic sites scattered across the Sahara, some aligned with the stars, others built in patterns whose meaning we can only guess. These sites, Nabta Playa in Egypt, the megaliths of the Tassili Najjar in Algeria, and stone tombs in Libya, hint at a shared architectural tradition stretching across thousands of miles. Authoritative fact: the stone circles at Nabta Playa, dated to around 5000 BCE, are some of the oldest known astronomical alignments in the world, predating Stonehenge by nearly 2,000 years. Odd fact: in 2008, researchers studying ancient cow bones from Nabta Playa found cut marks that suggest complex butchery and possibly ritual sacrifice, showing a surprising level of ceremonial sophistication for what was thought to be a nomadic herding society. Historians are still debating whether these megalithic cultures could have developed the engineering capacity to build something on the scale of the Giza pyramids. Traditionalists argue that the technical leap is too great, that moving from modest stone circles to 2.3 million block pyramids would require centuries of intermediate structures, none of which have been found. Alternative theorists counter that the absence of intermediate structures is precisely the point. They were lost, buried, or dismantled, their stones repurposed during the long march toward desertification. If we entertain the possibility that the builders were a separate culture, we have to ask how their knowledge reached the Nile Valley. Did they migrate en masse as the Sahara dried, bringing with them their skills, tools, and astronomical traditions? Or were they already connected to the Nile communities through trade and marriage, slowly blending their knowledge into what would become early Egyptian society? An intriguing hypothesis is that these proto-builders were what anthropologists call a dispersed network culture. Instead of one centralized kingdom, they might have been a web of small, loosely linked communities spread across North Africa, united by common symbols and shared construction techniques. The pyramids, in this view, could have been a final spectacular expression of that shared identity, an act of preservation before their way of life vanished. In such a scenario, the plateau at Giza could have been chosen as a symbolic convergence point, not just for its geology or location, but because it lay at the crossroads of multiple cultural spheres: the river people to the east, the desert nomads to the west, and the Nubian communities to the south. The pyramid complex could have been a diplomatic monument as much as a tomb, an effort to anchor a fragmented world in stone. Off-topic but fascinating. In 2014, archaeologists in Western Egypt uncovered rock carving showing boats with high, curving prows, designs not typically seen in the Nile Valley until much later. These could be representations of lake or sea vessels, suggesting that ancient North Africans were capable of travelling along vast inland waterways or even reaching the Mediterranean coast. If such vessels were part of the builder's toolkit, transporting large stone blocks becomes less of an unimaginable challenge. We can also look to genetic evidence. Studies of ancient remains from the Nile Delta and Sahara show a complex genetic tapestry, mixes of sub-Saharan, African, Near Eastern, and Mediterranean ancestry. If the pyramid builders were part of this mosaic, their identity may have been far more cosmopolitan than the image of isolated, ethnically homogeneous Egyptians suggests. Still, questions remain. If this pre-Egyptian culture was capable of building the pyramids, why do we find no written records in their own voice? Here, the debate turns to the fragility of early writing systems. They may have used perishable media, wood, leather, or woven mats, none of which survive in the desert's relentless environment. Or they may have relied on oral tradition, passing down architectural knowledge like a secret craft, only for it to vanish when their society collapsed. An offbeat detail: certain oral histories from Berber-speaking peoples of North Africa include tales of ancient giants, or stone people, who lived before the desert came, who could make the rocks walk. These are dismissed by many scholars as folk tales, but they are oddly specific in their imagery, often describing processions of blocks moving across the land. Whether metaphor or memory, they reflect a shared cultural fascination with monumental stonework that transcends recorded history. Historians are still debating whether such myths can preserve kernels of real events over thousands of years. Some point to Polynesian navigation lore and Aboriginal Dreamtime stories as examples of oral traditions that contain remarkably accurate descriptions of landscapes and events from deep prehistory. If North African myths hold similar echoes, they might be our only surviving link to the pyramid's true origins. Picture it: the last of the Green Sahara's builders, aware their world is dying, hauling stone in vast coordinated efforts. Their elders watch the lakes shrink and the dust storms grow more frequent. They know that their children will live in a harsher land, and so they pour their labour into a monument that will outlast them, a message in stone to future peoples. We were here. We could do this. Remember us. And perhaps that message was misunderstood. When the dynastic Egyptians rose to power, they might have seen the pyramids not as inherited architecture, but as divine proof of their own mandate to rule. A pharaoh placing his name on an ancient monument is not unlike a conqueror planting a flag. It asserts ownership regardless of who actually built it. If this is true, then the question shifts from how did the Egyptians build the pyramids to how did they integrate the pyramids into their own identity. That's not just a matter of history, it's a matter of rewriting the story of one of the world's most iconic civilizations. If the pyramids were the work of a vanished culture, what became of their tools? The absence of conclusive archaeological evidence for massive, sophisticated machinery is one of the thorniest points in the debate. The orthodox position is that copper chisels, wooden sledges, and ropes were sufficient for the job, provided enough manpower was available. But the numbers don't quite add up. Even generous estimates of workforce size and efficiency leave gaps that make space for alternative possibilities. One hypothesis proposes that the builders, whoever they were, possessed a specialized form of stone-cutting technology now lost to us. This doesn't mean lasers or alien drills, although those ideas make for good late-night radio, but rather advanced techniques using materials and methods that wouldn't necessarily survive the ages. Experiments with dolerite pounders, for example, show that hard stone can be shaped with remarkable precision, but they also reveal how exhausting and slow the process would have been at the scale of millions of blocks. Authoritative fact: archaeologists have found dolerite pounders weighing up to 30 kilograms in ancient quarries, suggesting they were indeed used extensively in shaping limestone and granite. Odd fact: in 2017, engineers testing replicas of ancient copper tools discovered that adding sand to the cutting process dramatically increased efficiency, essentially turning the chisel into a primitive saw. The surprising part. This technique is not widely documented in Egyptological literature, raising questions about whether it was a lost common practice. Historians are still debating whether the evidence we have is representative of the tools actually used. The survival bias is enormous. Wood rots, fibres disintegrate, and even copper corrodes away over millennia. What if the true game-changing tools were made of materials entirely gone from the archaeological record? Imagine reinforced wooden frameworks with tightly stretched rawhide, soaked in resins to prevent wear, acting as giant tension saws. Such tools could slice through limestone far more quickly than pounding or chiseling. Some fringe hypotheses venture further, suggesting the use of sound or vibration in stone shaping, pointing to ancient traditions that speak of singing stones or tones that moved mountains. While mainstream archaeology treats these stories as metaphor, experimental archaeology has shown that resonant vibration can indeed cause microfracturing in certain rocks, making them easier to break. Could an ancient culture have stumbled upon a method of combining rhythmic labour with resonant sound to aid in construction? It's speculative, yes, but not impossible. Off-topic but intriguing. The modern city of Aswan, near the famed granite quarries, is home to a long-standing tradition of rhythmic work songs sung by stonemasons. These songs are thought to help synchronize movements, but some ethnomusicologists note that their particular tempos align closely with natural vibration frequencies in granite. Whether coincidence or cultural inheritance, it's an oddly poetic echo of an idea that sound and stone might have been linked in ancient practice. Transporting the blocks poses another puzzle. The official explanation, hauling on sledges over lubricated sand, has been demonstrated in small-scale experiments, but scaling that up to multi-ton granite beams transported hundreds of kilometres is daunting. A Dutch team's 2014 experiment found that pouring water on sand reduced friction by up to 50%, but it still required massive human effort. Now imagine applying that technique over long distances, across varied terrain, under a scorching sun. The labour cost would be staggering. Alternative ideas abound. One is that the builders exploited the Nile's annual flood more directly than we think, floating blocks on barges much closer to the construction site than modern models suggest. Another is that they constructed temporary canals, flooding low-lying ground all the way to the base of the plateau. The absence of visible canal remnants today doesn't rule this out. Ancient channels could have silted up or been repurposed by later agricultural work. An even more radical hypothesis proposes the use of counterweighted ramps that could be raised or lowered to move blocks vertically. This would require significant engineering knowledge, but not necessarily beyond what a Bronze Age culture could achieve if it specialised in large-scale construction. Timber, rope and stone ballast could create a kind of seesaw mechanism, shifting blocks upward in stages with fewer hands than a traditional ramp would demand. The question of lost technology ties into a larger, more uncomfortable thought, that history as we know it may be punctuated by brief bursts of innovation that flare up, burn bright, and vanish, leaving only their monuments behind. We tend to think of technological progress as linear, but archaeology suggests otherwise. Cultures can lose skills as easily as they gain them. When the Roman Empire collapsed, for example, the formula for their famously durable concrete was forgotten for over 1,000 years. If the pyramid builders had unique methods for quarrying, shaping, and moving stone, the loss of that knowledge could have been abrupt. A sudden climate shift, epidemic, or political upheaval might have broken the chain of apprenticeship in a single generation. Without written records or sustained demand for monumental building, the skills could have evaporated almost overnight. This possibility forces us to confront how fragile human achievements can be. You might imagine that something as impressive as pyramid building would be carefully documented and safeguarded, but that's our modern mindset steeped in archives and cloud backups. In a world where survival often trumped preservation, the knowledge might have been viewed as a trade secret, passed only to a select few. When those few were gone, the secret went with them. Offbeat fact. In 1901, archaeologists discovered the Antikythera mechanism in a shipwreck off Greece, a complex geared device over 2,000 years old that could predict astronomical positions. Its existence completely rewrote our understanding of ancient Greek engineering. If such a sophisticated instrument could sink unnoticed into the depths of history, why not a set of advanced construction methods from North Africa's deep past? Historians are still debating whether our inability to reconstruct the exact process means the methods were extraordinary, or simply that we haven't replicated the right combination of ordinary tools. Both positions are defensible, but they lead to very different visions of history. One of human ingenuity climbing steadily toward greater skill, the other of peaks and valleys, with some of the highest peaks now hidden by the sands of time. Perhaps the greatest irony is that the pyramids themselves, supposedly eternal, are less permanent than the mystery of their construction. Blocks erode, casing stones vanish, and graffiti fades. But the unanswered question persists. It weaves itself into every conversation about ancient history. How much do we really know? And how much have we simply decided to stop questioning? Imagine standing in the shadow of the Great Pyramid as the last light of day turns its weathered stones gold. Around you, tourists snap photos, guides repeat well-rehearsed stories, and the desert wind hums through the gaps in the masonry. Beneath your feet, perhaps, lies the ghost of a lost machine, a decayed rope, or a broken tool that could end the debate forever. But it's buried deep, and the desert has no intention of giving it back, and so we speculate. We imagine wooden gears turning under the sun, stone slabs gliding along flooded causeways, songs timed to the heartbeat of the earth itself. We picture hands, calloused, strong, purposeful, shaping blocks for reasons we may never fully grasp. The mystery endures not because we lack evidence, but because the pyramids invite us to dream bigger than the evidence allows. If the pyramids were not the work of the Egyptians as we know them, then the implications for world history are staggering. It would mean that the timeline we've carefully assembled, one that begins with scattered Neolithic settlements, passes through the first dynasties, and culminates in the great monuments, would be missing a chapter. Not just a paragraph or a footnote, but an entire civilization erased from our cultural memory. This possibility raises an uncomfortable question. If such a civilization existed, why have we not found more of its traces? The short answer might be that we have found them, just not in contexts we recognize. Many ancient artifacts defy easy categorization, and when they don't fit neatly into the accepted chronology, they are either reinterpreted or set aside. Authoritative fact: archaeologists routinely find artifacts in Egypt that predate the First Dynasty, but are clearly the products of organized societies, carved stone vessels, intricate flint knives, and symbolic objects whose functions remain unknown. These are usually attributed to the so-called pre-dynastic cultures, but in some cases the sophistication of these artifacts seems at odds with the level of technology inferred from their supposed era. Odd fact: in the early 20th century, a collection of stone vases from the tomb of Pharaoh Jer was found to be made of materials like diorite and schist, so hard they can barely be worked with modern steel tools. Yet these vases were crafted with precise symmetry and thin walls, as if shaped on a lathe, except no lathe has ever been found from that period. Historians are still debating whether these vases represent extraordinary individual craftsmanship or the remnant of a vanished tradition of stoneworking. One hypothesis suggests that Egypt's pre-dynastic past was not a slow evolution from scattered tribes, but a cultural aftershock from an earlier centralized society. Perhaps the pyramids themselves were a legacy project, constructed as a cultural anchor or as a message from the old world to the new. Imagine inheriting not just a piece of land, but a vast engineering tradition and the responsibility to maintain it. If the early dynastic Egyptians inherited the pyramids, it would explain certain stylistic shifts in architecture. The Great Pyramids of Giza stand apart from later constructions, both in scale and precision. The Step Pyramid of Djoser is often presented as a precursor to the smooth-sided pyramids, but its design and execution are markedly different, almost as if the builders were experimenting without fully understanding the methods of their predecessors. There's a strange melancholy in this thought, that even the Egyptians so long ago might have looked upon these monuments with a sense of awe and mystery. Could they have wondered, just as we do now, how such works were achieved? Could the official records of the Old Kingdom have been as much an exercise in myth-making as modern history books are today? Off-topic but curious. In 2013, during restoration work at the Great Pyramid, researchers discovered a small void hidden behind a block in the upper structure. Inside were fragments of cedar wood, a ball of twine, and a copper hook. While they may have been tools left by workers, their exact purpose is still debated. One team proposed that the hook was part of a pulley system. Another suggested it was merely a symbolic offering to the gods. The fact that such basic questions remain unanswered illustrates how much of pyramid building is still opaque to us. The search for evidence of a pre-Egyptian pyramid building culture has led some researchers far afield. Ancient floodplains of the Nile Delta, remain largely unexplored due to modern urban development. In these regions, older layers are buried beneath meters of silt deposited by millennia of floods. It's entirely possible that remnants of earlier settlements, workshops, or even smaller pyramids lie hidden beneath modern villages. Historians are still debating whether aerial surveys and ground-penetrating radar will ever resolve these mysteries. While satellite imaging has revealed hundreds of unknown sites in Egypt, excavation is slow and politically complicated. Some regions are simply off-limits due to modern infrastructure, meaning our picture of ancient Egypt is shaped as much by practical constraints as by historical truth. If the pyramids came from an earlier civilization, one tantalizing possibility is that they were part of a network of monuments spanning more than just Egypt. Certain megalithic sites in the Sahara, like the stone circle of Nabta Playa, date to periods when the desert was a fertile savanna. These alignments show advanced astronomical knowledge and a concern with tracking celestial cycles, qualities shared by the pyramid complex at Giza. Could there have been a culture that once thrived across what is now an arid desert, leaving behind stone markers as both practical observatories and ceremonial centres? From a human perspective, the implications are almost too large to grasp. It would mean that civilizations rise and fall not in a straight line, but in waves, sometimes reaching heights we can't replicate today before slipping back into obscurity. It would also mean that the pyramids, far from being the starting point of monumental architecture, might actually be the final echo of a much older story. Offbeat fact: in the 1960s, a series of fossilized human footprints was discovered in the ashbeds of Lutoli, Tanzania. These prints are 3.6 million years old, left by hominins long before Homo sapiens existed. They remind us that traces of the past can survive against all odds, even if the story behind them is lost. Could something similar have happened in Egypt, where the monuments outlived the people who understood them? If so, the pyramids might be less a triumph of human planning than a monument to human forgetfulness. They could be the stone equivalent of an old photograph found in an attic, beautiful, evocative, but disconnected from the living context that once gave it meaning. And yet, there is a strange comfort in that possibility. It means that history is not a straight corridor, but a vast landscape, full of hidden valleys and overgrown paths. Every so often, we stumble onto a clearing, a pyramid, a carved vase, a circle of stones in the desert, and realize that we're not the first to walk here, nor the first to wonder. Standing in the shadow of the pyramids today, you can almost feel that layered history pressing in. The desert wind that stings your face has touched the same stones for thousands of years, carrying whispers from a time before history began. The heat rising from the limestone smells faintly of dust and sun, as if the rocks themselves have been baking for eternity. Perhaps the real mystery is not who built the pyramids, but why we find it so hard to accept that we may never know. Our modern minds crave closure, an answer neatly filed away, but the pyramids resist that. They are like a riddle with too many missing words, forcing you to fill in the blanks with your own imagination, and maybe, just maybe, that's what keeps them alive in our collective memory. Not the stones themselves, but the questions they inspire. If we follow the thread of possibility to its end, we arrive at a moment where the lines between fact, legend, and personal conviction blur. Imagine for a moment that tomorrow morning, an excavation beneath the shifting sands of the western desert uncovers a stone tablet, not just with vague carvings, but with clear, undeniable writing that predates dynastic Egypt by centuries. The inscription, translated in the first flush of excitement, states plainly, "We built these monuments for the eternal memory of our people, who came before the Nile kingdoms." The shock would ripple through every classroom, every museum, every history book. For decades, the pyramids have stood as symbols of Egypt's own ingenuity and endurance. To strip them of that direct authorship would be like discovering that the Mona Lisa was painted not by Leonardo da Vinci, but by some unknown artist centuries earlier, and yet the work would still remain magnificent. The stones would still glow in the sun, the corridors would still echo in silence, and the sense of wonder would not diminish. But the story we tell about them would change forever. Authoritative fact: there is precedent for seismic shifts in our understanding of the past. In 1871, Heinrich Schliemann uncovered the ruins of Troy in what is now Turkey, confirming that a city long thought to be myth had actually existed. This didn't erase Homer's Iliad, but it reframed it, blurring the boundaries between epic poetry and historical record. A similar revelation about the pyramids would force a comparable rewriting of our cultural narrative. Odd fact: in 2017, engineers scanning the Great Pyramid with muon radiography, a technique that detects subatomic particles passing through stone, found a massive hidden chamber above the Grand Gallery. It's still inaccessible and nobody knows what's inside. Some suggest it's a structural feature, others think it may hold ceremonial or functional purpose. Historians are still debating whether this void is a key to understanding the pyramid's construction, or just another architectural quirk that will lead to more questions than answers. A prominent hypothesis among alternative historians is that the pyramids may have been part of a much older planetary network, sites aligned not just to the stars, but to each other across vast distances. From the megaliths of Karnak in France to the temple complexes of Teotihuacan in Mexico, certain patterns of orientation, scale, and astronomical precision appear again and again. The mainstream explanation is that human beings across the world independently discovered similar engineering solutions and celestial alignments. But if you take the more radical view, it suggests something else entirely: a shared legacy, perhaps inherited from a common source lost in deep prehistory. If we entertain this idea, then the pyramids become more than just tombs. They could be repositories, structures designed to endure for thousands of years, holding within their walls not treasure, but knowledge. Ancient cultures often encoded information in architecture, embedding astronomical cycles, calendars, and mathematical constants into stone. The Great Pyramid's dimensions, for example, have been said, though controversially, to encode values close to the speed of light, the circumference of the Earth, and even the ratio of pi. Historians are still debating whether these correlations are intentional, coincidental, or simply the result of human pattern seeking. Off-topic but strangely relevant. In the vault of a museum in London sits the Antikythera mechanism, a 2,000-year-old Greek device that functioned as an analog computer for predicting astronomical positions. It was pulled from a shipwreck in 1901, corroded and unremarkable at first glance. Decades passed before X-ray analysis revealed its complexity. If such an object could be lost at sea and forgotten for centuries, why couldn't the tools or blueprints behind the pyramids suffer a similar fate? In this light, the question, what if the pyramids were never built by the Egyptians, becomes less about assigning credit and more about opening the aperture of our imagination. It forces us to consider history not as a linear march, but as a collage of overlapping and sometimes incompatible stories. Some of those stories we tell with confidence, others we whisper, unsure if they're true, and some are carved in stone, waiting for someone, perhaps us, perhaps a future civilization to decipher them. Yet even as we speculate, the pyramids remain indifferent to our theories. They do not lean toward one narrative or another. They do not confirm or deny. The wind moves over their faces the same way it has for thousands of years, wearing the edges down by the width of a grain of sand. The stars they align with rise and set in cycles that dwarf human memory. Whether they were built by the Egyptians we know from history, or by an earlier forgotten people, their reality is unchanged. And perhaps that's the final irony. Our obsession with origins is a deeply human trait. We want to know who, when, how, and why. But the pyramids remind us that some things will always be bigger than our questions. They will outlast not only us but the civilizations that follow us. One day, someone else, centuries or millennia from now, may stand where you stand, looking up at these monuments and wondering who built them. And maybe, just like us, they will realise that the answer may never come. Still, the act of wondering is not without value. It is the wondering that drives us to dig, to measure, to argue late into the night. It is the wondering that keeps history alive, even when the facts are fragmentary. It is the wondering that connects us to those who came before, whether they lived 5,000 years ago or 50,000. So if the pyramids were never built by the Egyptians, then what are they? Perhaps they are messages in a bottle, hurled far into the future by hands we will never shake. Perhaps they are warnings, or monuments to a disaster we can barely imagine. Or perhaps they are just what they appear to be, stone mountains in the desert, beautiful because they exist, mysterious because they endure. And maybe that's enough. The desert is quiet now. The last light of day has faded into a violet horizon, and the air has grown cool, carrying only the soft hiss of shifting sand. Somewhere out there, the pyramids still stand, their shapes drawn in pale silver by the moon. You can almost see them the way travellers did thousands of years ago, silent, unblinking, impossible to ignore. You let your thoughts drift back over the journey we've taken tonight, the debates, the evidence, the strange possibilities, historians leaning over fragile papyrus, engineers tapping at scanning devices, dreamers staring at the stars searching for patterns. Whether the pyramids were built by the Egyptians you learned about in school or by some older, forgotten people, the truth is the mystery is part of their beauty. The stones themselves seem to hum with patience. They have endured every wind, every flood, every shifting of the dunes. They have watched empires rise and crumble, and they will likely watch many more. The story you and I tell here will fade, as all stories do, but those stones will keep their secrets a little longer. Your breathing slows. The pictures in your mind blur at the edges. Sunlight on pale limestone, a shadow falling across ancient steps, a doorway leading into darkness. The details matter less now. What remains is the feeling of standing before something older than your memory, older than your language, and knowing it will outlast you. It's all right to let the questions rest for now. Let the sand cover them, just for the night. Let the stars pass silently overhead. The pyramids will still be there in the morning. Sleep well. Good night.